The Billionaire's Housekeeper by Kiana Campbell. A romancely.com story. Chapter 1.
George Ainsworth wasn't used to being alone. It was going to take some time for him to come to terms with that. Falling in love in college, getting married, starting his career right away and earning more in a week than most people would in several years. Now he was sitting alone on one of the many balconies of his mansion. The house appeared to be a lot more spacious now that Julie had left and taken some of her things with her. Divorce was never easy, but being in a loveless marriage was even more difficult. With all the money, power, and parties over the years, Julie had grown cold and distant. She manipulated the people around her in order to get anything she wanted. She was a debutante and the daughter of a wealthy banker. She had always been spoiled, but her heart had softened when she met George in their junior year at university. Over time, her childish tantrums and controlling nature froze her heart back up, and now George's heart was hardened. Ice and stone was not a good mix. No, George Ainsworth was not used to being alone. Not in such a large house. Not without all the parties. The only people to keep him company were his staff, and the paparazzi outside trying to get a story about the divorce. Mr. Ainsworth? That made George jump. He was reflecting on the last few years of his life, feeling 70 instead of 29, and he hadn't heard the soft tapping on the door. His housekeeper Rita came in with a silver tray on a trolley. On it were a few slices of toast, some shortbread, butter, and a small kettle for tea. "Rita, you startled me," George said, clearing his throat. He hadn't asked for breakfast, but he could tell that Beatrice was worried about him. George was constantly busy and had a habit of forgetting to eat until Beatrice made something for him and Rita brought it in. "I'm sorry," Rita said. She picked up the tray and set it on a small table next to George. He was sitting on the balcony of his former wife's art studio. The room was completely bare except for a few tables and some empty bookshelves. Rita couldn't help but feel sorry for him. George looked as if he were in mourning no matter what color he wore. He had on a black shirt under his butter yellow sweater. His legs were crossed, and he stared at the gardens below. Rita felt as if he was looking beyond the gardens. In his own sort of Jay Gatsby way, he was searching for the green light that Julie must have possessed somewhere over the estate walls. She shook the thought away, and George turned to look at her for a moment. He caught her looking at him, but when she stopped her imagination from going overboard, she turned to leave. "Rita?" George asked. "Yes, Mr. Ainsworth," Rita said. "Would you sit with me for a while?" George had never really stopped to have proper conversations with Rita. He worked constantly, but he was always nice to her whenever they did get around to speaking. Rita was usually quiet around him, and Julie kept her busy. "I'm not sure I'll be able to stay for too long. Beatrice needs me in the kitchen to help with lunch, and I have some things to do in the garden before I head to town to go shopping. Do you have a list of things for me to get?" "Shit," George said. Rita tried her best to stifle a smile. Whenever George did speak to her, there was usually a swear word coming out of his mouth. He was always frustrated with someone at work, or something he had read in the paper, but hearing him swear always made her laugh because she knew a joke was coming next. George could never stay too angry for long, not even at Julie. Rita could tell he was truly frustrated when he would sit alone, silently, legs crossed and ruminating. "Julie always makes up the shopping list. I have no idea what to get. What do you think I should get?" George asked in a voice filled with panic. He looked like a deer caught in headlights. His gray-green eyes swirled in confusion. Rita laughed. Her mouth widened, revealing her white teeth that countered her beautiful dark skin. "Well, I think you should get food," Rita said, still laughing. That made George laugh too. He relaxed his shoulders a bit. He didn't notice he was so tense, until he felt so free just laughing. He listened to the gentle change in tone of Rita's accent. George knew she grew up in Montreal, but they hadn't had enough long conversations for him to have picked up on her accent. There were some words that sounded more French than English, and that made the sound of her laughter more magical. It was like her accent traveled from her words to the way she giggled. Rita's laughter distracted him from the things on his mind. George's thoughts were swimming in circles around a single word. Alone. It was still such a difficult concept for him to grasp. When he wasn't living with his parents, he was away at college, and then right after that he was married. It was strange now for him to really have to take care of himself without someone looking out for him. Left to himself, he would be at work constantly and would possibly even die of starvation without realizing it. "How long have you been working with us, Rita?" The question sounded strange even to George. He almost corrected himself because he had said us, as if Julie was still at the mansion living with them. He thought better of it and waited for Rita to respond. He fixated his eyes on her face. From her high cheekbones, to her dark almond-shaped eyes, to her heart-shaped lips, to the way her dark skin glowed in various lights. His eyes moved about her features, but they didn't linger on one spot for too long, so that his gaze would make her feel self-conscious. Rita was admittedly taken aback by the question. This was the longest they had stopped to just chat before. George cracked the occasional joke during times of frustration, or he would ask for Rita to do him a favor since he was stuck on his phone or laptop at home working. This was the first time that he talked and asked her anything about herself. "Oh, about 3 years, Mr. Ainsworth," Rita said. She clasped her hands in front of her and nervously began to twiddle her thumbs. She wasn't sure where her shyness was coming from. "Ah, I see," George said. He opened his mouth for a second. He looked like he was about to say something else, but then thought better of it. "I don't want to keep you, Rita. I'd better get down to the kitchen," Rita said at the same time. They both smiled at each other, but Rita avoided making eye contact by looking down. George turned his eyes toward the garden again, looking pensive. Rita thought that he must have been so heartbroken. He had slowly become this pensive and almost stone-like person over the few years that she had known him. She wanted to offer words of encouragement, or at least try to say something that may cheer him up, but no words were coming to her either. She curtsied and turned to leave. "Try to have a good day," George said stiffly. If humor wasn't involved, he was finding it hard to be a warm person. "Yes, Mr. Ainsworth," Rita replied softly. "Please call me George," he said, looking at her briefly before once again facing the garden. "Yes, George," Rita said. She paused before saying his name. It sounded almost unfamiliar to her given the fact that she'd never called him by his first name before. Her accent made her say his name almost delicately, like she was afraid to break it. She stepped out of the empty art studio, adjusted the blouse she was wearing, and then headed back downstairs to the kitchen to help Beatrice with lunch. The house felt emptier even before most of the furniture was moved out. The absence of one of Rita's employers was a new change, but she had sensed the wedge between Julie Ainsworth and her husband George for some time now. What Rita noticed most was that there were no tears. There were fights, bouts of coldness, and long silent times when Julie would lock herself away in her art studio, listening to Vivaldi, drinking wine, and splattering paint on everything but the canvas in front of her, calling it art when it was really her way of throwing a beautiful tantrum. George would call and ask Rita to tell Julie that he would be working late and would not be coming home. Rita could feel otherwise, though. She knew he just needed an excuse to stay away from the negative energy of their large house. Rita obliged, though. She would knock on the door and wait for the music to be turned down before Julie would tell her to come in. Rita would come with a book or a tray of Julie's favorite chocolates. She always wanted to ease the news, even though it wasn't outright bad news. "Mr. Ainsworth says he will be coming home tomorrow. He is very busy at the moment," Rita said. She said the words slowly, choosing them carefully. She didn't want to upset Julie further. She would put the tray of whatever goodies she had down on a small round table and wait for Julie to react. Sometimes Julie would scoff, have a sip of wine, and turn around to turn up the classical music again. Other times her sentences would start with, "Well, you tell my husband." Rita didn't know what to do then. Whenever Julie had an unpleasant message for George, Rita would keep it to herself. She didn't want to be the messenger. A back and forth was hardly necessary. George would be home more often when Julie was on a retreat or a charity function in another country. He preferred the silence, and to pace around the place instead of lock himself in a room. It fascinated Rita how different they were, and she wondered if they had always been that way, or if it was something that occurred over time. He never had bitter messages to relay to Julie. Instead, he would nod and to himself before continuing his pacing about the place. There was always something on George Ainsworth's mind, but Rita didn't think it was her place to ask him about himself. They weren't friends. They were from completely different walks of life, and he was her boss. How strange would it be for her friend to pay her anyway? She knew that Mr. Ainsworth hadn't gotten any happier since the separation. There was paparazzi lined up outside, asking why such a wealthy software tycoon and his debutante wife would call it quits after being college sweethearts. And now that a lot of the furniture was gone, Rita's workload was significantly cut down. She still loved her job, and she hoped that Mr. Ainsworth would find a reason to still need her even without his wife being the one who mostly needed her. George. He had asked Rita to call him by his first name that morning. She said the name aloud, but barely above a whisper. It was strange to say, but she admitted that she liked to say it. George, she whispered again to herself. There you are. Rita screamed and practically jumped out of her skin. She was on the lanai with a feather duster. She had been cleaning, but she picked up an old photograph of George and Julie, and she started to think about them. She didn't know how long she had been caught in a daydream of former lovers, but she was completely embarrassed to be caught staring into space and whispering the names of her employer to herself. Oh, don't be scared, silly, it's just me. Jose Fuentes shuffled over to her and gave her a kiss on the cheek. Rita gave Jose a warm hug. He was the Ainsworth's gardener and head landscaper. He came once or twice a week to tend to the grounds. He had worked for them for 5 years, and when Rita came a few years later, he and she had formed a lasting friendship. Where Rita was seemingly shy, Jose was wild and tumultuous. Where Rita was indecisive and kind, Jose would tell it like it is right away. They were yin and yang, total opposites that accepted the differences of each other and welcomed and embraced the similarities they shared. Were you talking to yourself? Jose asked. He put his hands on his hips. Me? No, I was just humming, Rita said. She tucked a strand of her curly hair behind her ear. Oh, really? Sounded a lot like you were saying George to me. A sly smile began to form on Jose's face. He said George in the same way that Rita did. He wasn't mocking her accent, but making fun of what he was now beginning to think was a new crush. It's nothing. It's just that yesterday morning he asked me to call him by his first name. After 3 years, Rita said pensively. Say Trace bizarre, she said, more to herself than to Jose. Yes, bizarre, Jose said dryly. He eyed her with faux suspicion before taking the feather duster from Rita and twirling it around. He twirled it by her face so that she could snap out of her trance. The man is just lonely, Marguerite. He probably wants to make friends. Jose grinned. He handed her the duster and made his way out onto the greens of the gardens. Jose was more than likely right. Rita had been working for the Ainsworths and living at the mansion for such a long time that she was so used to things being a certain way. Now that Julie was gone, everything had changed. She didn't know just how to process everything that had happened over the course of the last few months. Since she wasn't even a part of the family, no one thought to mention how this may affect her or her job. Rita. It was George. He usually woke up early and went in to work before 9. It was just after 8:30 now, and he was probably in search of something to nibble on before heading out to run his company. Rita always got an early start to her work. There was lots to be done overseeing the others who worked at the mansion, and a lot of work of her own. She also liked evenings in her own space and doing what she liked with her time. She usually called her mother in Montreal or watched some TV. It got lonely, but it was better than how things had been right before she moved to the States. Montreal was not the place for her, even when she missed her mother and the rest of her family terribly. Yes, Mr. George, Rita said, correcting herself halfway. That made George smile. Take some getting used to, huh? He asked when he came into view. He stood by one of the open French doors. Rita almost stopped dead in her tracks when she saw him. He was always in business attire when he went to work, or sometimes he would wear a polo shirt and very smart slacks. Rita had pressed them, of course. She knew most, if not all, of the clothes that he owned. Today, George was in a suit, but he was tugging the collar of his white shirt. He had on a black jacket and black pants. His shoes had been shined to perfection, and his normally curly blonde hair had a bit of gel in it. He looked like he was coming straight out of a Bond movie. Rita could see that George was trying to adjust a red bow tie. "Looking sharp, Mr. A." Jose Wolf whistled and walked by the lanai. His chubby body moved this way and that as he marched and tried to avoid getting grass stains on his shoes. His shorts were just above his knees, and his shirt was tucked into his shorts while his stomach bulged a bit over the edge. George raised his eyes to the ceiling and sighed. It was his way of rolling his eyes. He never quite made the full rotation. He smiled at Jose, showing off a small dimple at the top right corner of his mouth. "Thanks, Jose," George said. Jose saluted and dragged a hose along with him as he turned a corner to the west side of the house. The roses were his specialty. There were yellow and pink roses lined along the side of the house that led to a garden maze of red, white, and pink roses further out on the grounds. A small fountain was in the center of the little maze. Jose was so proud of his work in the rose garden that it was the first part of the garden he would work on whenever he came to the mansion. "Rita, I need your help with something," George said. He tugged more on his collar. "I normally just use a clip-on, but there's this really fancy charity dinner tonight. I was wondering if you knew how to tie a bow tie." Rita put down the duster and wiped her hands on her thighs. She walked over to George and he walked over to her. They met each other halfway, and an awkward little chortle escaped Rita's lips. "Let me take a look. I'm out of practice, but I'll give it a try," Rita said. "You talk so quietly, Rita," George said. He raised his head up to give Rita space to fiddle with the tie around his neck. His eyes darted from the ceiling above him and then down to try to look at Rita while they talked to each other. "I'm just shy, I guess. Quiet voice." Rita laughed nervously. George was about to nod, but remembered that he had to keep his head up. He gently touched both of her arms right below her shoulders. It was a gesture to reassure her. Rita's fingers were shaking a bit, and it took her a few tries to try to loop it properly. "Maybe if I put it around my own neck," she offered. She took the bow tie off of George, her fingers sweeping along the collars of his shirt as she did so. George lowered his head and studied Rita's movements as she put the bow tie around her own neck and attempted to loop it. They stood silently in front of each other, Rita being too shy to know what to say, and George being too stiff to make conversation. They were worlds apart even though they were less than a foot away from each other. Rita finally got the bow tie just right and loosened it just enough for it to go back over her head. George didn't put it on, but he held it up using one finger and thanked her. "Ah, crap. I need to get out of these clothes and head to work. I'm running late as it is," George said. Rita stifled a smile as George cursed a bit more and started to turn to go back into the house. "It's a good thing I don't have any meetings today. Mr. A." A voice from the side of the house shouted in a sing-song tone. "Oh, Mr. A." Jose was power walking when he turned the corner, and he headed straight for the lanai. George had turned back around and stood to face Jose. Jose was getting out of breath and red in the face. "Okay, Mr. A, I don't want to alarm you, but there's a lot of paparazzi at the front of the house," Jose said. Even though he was puffing and panting, he managed to say all that he needed to say in one breath. George groaned, but it wasn't surprising. Sometimes the press would camp outside his house when he had made a new development in the software industry, or if Julie had a function to attend to or would speak up about a charity luncheon she was having. "I'll have Jeffrey take me to work today then," George said bitterly. He never appreciated the media attention. He much preferred things quiet and simple in his space. "I'll do my best to avoid them. Thank you, Jose." "Mr. A, I don't think you understand," Jose said. He had a worried look on his face, and his eyes darted from George to Rita. "What is it?" George asked. Normally Rita would be minding her own business and going back to work. The way Jose had made his way towards them, and the way he was looking at her now made her freeze in place. "They don't want to talk to you." Jose paused and put a hand on his chest dramatically. "The press is here to see Rita. If you want more billionaire romances like this, please my love, be sure to subscribe to the Romancely YouTube channel. I look forward to spending more time with you. Subscribe and let's make it happen."
Chapter 2. Me? Rita asked. George's eyes were wide. The three of them looked utterly confused. Rita had no idea why they would want to speak to her. What for? George asked. His voice was getting defensive. It was one thing to drag him into some silly media business, but Rita didn't have anything to do with him or his affairs. I don't know. The minute they mentioned Rita, I turned around and came back this way, Jose said. Don't move. I'll try and get this sorted, George said. Rita could hear the aggravation building up in George's voice. He didn't like the press snooping around. They kept him from his work, and now having someone else being suckered into their nonsense was more than he wanted or needed. George furrowed his eyebrows and walked briskly off of the lanai and out of sight. What's going on? Jose asked. He eyed Rita, searching for even a hint of an answer from the expression on her face. I have no idea, Rita said. Her eyes flickered for a moment when realization hit her. There was a reason that the press would want to speak to her and not to George Ainsworth. No idea. Her voice shook, but she wasn't feeling much of anything. She had a calm look about her. It was only the sudden panic that George had and her mind reeling with possibilities that made her stay in place on the lanai. Rita's heart was now leaping in her chest despite being so still. The world around her seemed to be stuck in place, even Jose wasn't moving. The birds themselves had stopped chirping about the gardens, and the only thing that had any movement in the world at that moment was her heart. She was hoping she hadn't been found out. Rita had a secret, but she tried to stay relaxed because she was sure it was a secret that only she knew. She had kept it to herself for long enough. There was no way someone from the press could know anything about her. She kept the calm look on her face. It wasn't time for her to worry yet. She didn't know what it was the press knew. It could have been about something entirely different. It could have been something that involved George himself. Maybe they're trying to get Mr. Ainsworth's staff to reveal some information about him and the divorce, Rita thought to herself. It was wishful thinking, of course, but she wanted to make sure that the paparazzi wanting to speak to her had nothing to do with her. She spoke her thought aloud just to be sure that time hadn't frozen. Jose shrugged. Maybe. All I know is that Mr. better sort this out quick because right now I'm trying to do something about the marigolds out front and... Jose droned on and on about the work that he needed to do on the flowers. Rita was too busy thinking about her own situation to pay much attention to what Jose was saying. She saw a quick flash of someone passing by the French doors, and she could see that it was George. He had changed out of his tuxedo and was putting a jacket on over a shirt and comfortable pants. Rita rooted herself in place. It took a lot of willpower to not want to follow George to see what it was that was going on outside. How many people did you say were out there? Rita asked Jose. He shrugged as a response. More than 5, less than 15. Whatever it is they think they've found, they want a story badly. Are you sure there's nothing going on between you two? Rita nodded. We don't spend a lot of time conversing with each other. I don't know what's going on, she half lied. Even as close as Rita was with Jose, she still hadn't let him in on the full story of her life. It wouldn't be a good time to admit it now that she needed to know just what the paparazzi wanted with her. Jose took Rita by the wrist and started leading her inside the house. She twisted her arm a bit in resistance, but he stopped and turned to look at her. Do you want to know what's going on or not? I would, but nothing, Jose said in a shrill whisper. He looked around to see if there was anyone in sight who could possibly be listening in on their conversation. No buts. Let's find out what all of this is about. Rita didn't have a chance to finish her sentence. Jose was once again leading her back into the house and in the direction of the front entrance. She hoped that he was doing this for her benefit more so than to satisfy his own curiosity. "I don't want to talk to them," Rita hissed at Jose. He scoffed and stopped once again to take a good look at her. "Honey, who says anything about talking to them? I was just gonna eavesdrop from the front door." "There's the intercom right there," he said and pointed toward the door. Rita didn't like the idea of snooping around, but since this directly involved her, she was curious as to why the press suddenly had an interest in the live-in housekeeper of a handsome young billionaire. Jose and Rita skittered across the Italian marble floor like tiny guilty mice and almost made it to the front door when it suddenly opened. Surprised, Jose let go of Rita's wrist and pretended to engage her in conversation. "You know, flowers and wall sconces by the entranceway might really brighten this area up a bit. What are you thinking? Begonias. Oxalis," Jose said. He gesticulated wildly and kept sneaking glances at Rita. George had just stepped into the house and shut the giant iron doors. He leaned back on the doors and slowly slid down. "Nice cover," he said breathlessly, looking at Jose. Jose lowered his arms sheepishly. He didn't have to keep up the charade, they had been caught. "I still don't know what in the hell is going on out there." Rita lowered her eyes. She didn't want to see either of them looking at her. She felt exposed, and she wasn't even sure what the reason for it was yet. She could only speculate, but she was hoping it wasn't what she had feared for the last few years. There was no way someone could know about her life before she started working at the mansion because she had never told anyone all of the details. "What happened?" Rita asked. One of her arms was at her side, and she lifted the other to get hold of her elbow. She rubbed along her straightened arm with her thumb. She looked up every few moments just so she could possibly decipher the expressions on his face. She hoped he wasn't upset with her. She couldn't tell because he appeared to still be out of breath. "They kept saying I should ask you, and that they'd get to the bottom of it sooner than later if you wouldn't come out. They wanted to know more about where you're from. I thought it was extremely peculiar." Rita didn't have a response to that. Whatever it was they wanted to know about where she was from, she hoped that they weren't talking about when she had left Montreal. "I won't let them get to you. I promise," George said. He moved away from the door and over to Rita and Jose. He looked at her as her eyes floated upward to meet his gaze. He didn't look away, and neither did she. She felt assured just by staring into his eyes. They're just like roaches that are looking for whatever they can find. They're probably gonna find some cock and bull story about me and Julie. Don't you worry about anything, okay? I won't, Rita said. She straightened her body and smiled. Whatever this was going to pass. But it still made her wonder and worry just what it was that the press thought they knew about her. I've got to get going. I should have been at work by now. Don't talk to anyone until I get back. And even then, George said. He turned to leave the mansion. He left Rita and Jose standing close to the entrance. Neither of them spoke for a good few minutes. All right, Missy, you have some explaining to do, Jose said finally. He pursed his lips in the way that he did when he wasn't impressed by a situation. He eyed her up and down, folded his arms over his chest and tapped his foot on the floor as if to wait for her to start speaking right away. I don't know what you mean, Rita raised her head in a defiant manner. Oh, cut the crap, Marguerite. Only my mother calls me that, Rita grumbled. Whenever Jose was frustrated with her, he called her by her full name. You're stalling. How can I help you if you won't open up to me? Jose feigned hurt and he pouted his lip dramatically. What exactly am I getting help for? Rita laughed. Jose was right, she was stalling. But she didn't know where to start or where to end. She didn't know if he would understand. She had known him for 3 years, and there was definitely trust there when it came to their friendship. She just wasn't sure she liked opening up to people. She didn't know how he would react. "I don't know yet," Jose admitted. "But someone out there knows something. I don't want them defaming your character. You're one of my favorite people on this hellhole we call planet Earth. The least you can do is dish out some juicy gossip." Rita sighed. There would be no letting up with Jose. She studied his face for a few seconds. She had held out for this long. But if something were to happen, she needed someone here who she trusted and who really cared for her to be on her side. She didn't know what could happen if someone were to know all of her story. Worse if word got out to the police. She decided to tell him. She wasn't going to tell the full story. She was going to keep it as vague as possible. She wanted him to be satisfied enough to leave her alone, but to be in the know about what it was that she was dealing with. "Fine. I'll tell you," she caved. "Wunderbar. Is it about George? Are you sure you guys aren't a thing? I kind of like the way you look together. You're chocolate with his vanilla, you guys would be." "Jose! Focus! I'm about to let you into a very dark part of my past. It's not about Mr. Ainsworth. Even he doesn't know what I'm about to tell you. I'll tell you my secret. Just not here." Rita linked arms with Jose, and she led him back out onto the lanai around the back of the mansion. She wanted to make sure she was away from any listening ears. Rita had spent most of her day distracting herself with work. She was so diligent that she was finished earlier than usual and even went around clearing up some of the rooms twice. She avoided the windows. If she walked into a room, she would shimmy along up against the wall like a novice spy and close the curtains. She knew there were still paparazzi outside. The number of them had almost tripled as the day went on. She would peek through the curtains whenever she was curious enough. By 5, the majority of them had given up and left. The sun had started to set when the last one had finally gone home. The guards didn't entertain them, and no one let them in under any circumstances. It was strange for Rita. Before, whenever there was press outside of the door, she would be able to go about her business without so much as batting an eyelash in their direction. The minute one mentioned her name, now it felt like there were eyes everywhere, watching her. She didn't like that feeling. She wanted everything to go back to normal. So much had changed with her work, herself, and Mr. Ainsworth since the divorce came through. Rita went outside and back to her little cottage that was close to the back of the property. It wasn't too far from the main house, but it was down a trail and out of sight. The cottage had its own unique style. It felt like a house not on someone's grounds, but a quaint little home for a couple or a young and hopeful person. Julie helped design it when Rita had first come to work for the Ainsworths. Julie was a little less insufferable then. She asked Rita for her opinions and her tastes with the decor, and the cottage was done to both of their liking. Over time, and with more wine and self-loathing, Julie didn't talk to Rita much anymore. Rita had just become another person to manipulate in order for Julie to get her way. Rita sighed when she stepped into her cottage. She didn't want to think of Julie or George anymore. She sometimes had to remind herself that their lives were not her whole life. With the days she had had, Rita just wanted to relax. She told Jose more about herself before she had left Montreal, and Jose vowed not to tell anyone. He also said that he would find a way to help her if she ever needed it, and let her know that everything would work itself out. She was so grateful for her friend. She wasn't alone in the world, but she felt alone in the country. Jose made her feel more at home since they had met, and Thursdays were definitely her favorite days because she knew that he would be there at the house tending to the roses and marigolds. There was one more person that Rita wanted to talk to about the day that she had. Her mother, Rita Brooks. Her mother was her confidant. Rita was the most supportive person in Rita's life. They spoke at least twice a week, and Rita knew about Rita's life as if Rita was still in Montreal with her. Rita picked up the little white telephone that was on the side table in her living room. She dialed her mother's number and placed the phone between her ear and her shoulder. She was fixing herself a sandwich in her little kitchen as the phone buzzed in her ear. Rita picked up on the fourth ring. Bonne nuit, maman, Rita greeted her mother. Hello, my darling. Rita could hear the smile in her mother's voice. Rita always sounded like Rita hadn't spoken to her for years, even if Rita had called once before on that very same day. How are you? What was your day like? They always asked each other about their days and if anything interesting happened. Rita's mother was an English teacher at a middle school in Montreal, so there was always a story about some rowdy teenager, or the politics of being one of the head teachers at the school versus the other teachers or a member of the board of directors. Rita mostly talked about her work, or something that Jose had told her. She was so glad to be still close with her mother. Rita was the only one that Rita could really talk to about the things she had in her head and her heart. My day. Rita paused to give it thought. My day was okay. Something's wrong, Rita said. Why you say that? It's your voice. I can always tell when you sound upset. What happened? I'm not even sure, Rita said. She knew her mother would immediately pick up on the fact that something had been bothering her. It's been a strange day. I've been thinking a lot. Don't think too deeply, my dear. It will only have you drowning in your own thoughts. Rita always gave the best advice. She was right, of course. Rita had been thinking an awful lot without even really knowing what the real situation was. It had helped to tell Jose the truth. It had been a release for Rita, and she still let the feeling of the beautiful day be shadowed by her fears and her thoughts. She was going to have to tell her mother, she knew. Rita would have to explain her feelings and what caused them. The last thing she wanted to do was to have her mother worry about her. I'll try, maman. Thanks for always being here. If only I could be there for you in person. But I know we'll see each other soon. Maman. Rita bit her lip. She was already emotional, and a lump developed in a deep part of her throat. She wouldn't cry on her own, but she felt that saying what she was about to say would break the proverbial levees. Do you think I'll be able to come back from this? I believe so more than you know, Rita said without skipping a beat. She knew what Rita was talking about. A mother always knew. Even though she wasn't sure she believed it, Rita gave a sigh of relief anyway. Those were the words she needed to hear. Her mother would always have her back and be on her side. And everything that happened before Rita left could have put her mother at risk. Rita didn't want to admit it, but she also constantly called her mother to ensure that she was still safe where she was. Rita didn't like that Rita was worried about her. Nothing had gone wrong in over 3 years. She wanted Rita to let go, and to move forward with her life without worry. It's very difficult keeping this. There were paparazzi outside of the mansion today. Rita told her mother. That's nothing to be worried about. Isn't there always paparazzi there? Rita replied. Rita couldn't see, but her mother shrugged her shoulders. It was different this time. This time they wanted to speak to me, Rita sounded exasperated. What if they know the reason why I'm here? How would I explain that to Mr. Ainsworth or anyone else? It's not like you're wanted for murder, Marguerite. You did what you needed to do. And what if Mr. Ainsworth finds out that I'm here illegally? I'm a black woman and I already have a different accent from everyone here. Times are so strange now. Any little thing can get someone sent back home. Rita couldn't hold back the tears any longer. They fell gently down her face, but she clenched her teeth down to keep from sobbing. She was frustrated, and all she wanted was to hug her mother and know that everything was going to be all right. She kept thinking of Mr. Ainsworth. She would hate to leave him, especially now that he was in such a vulnerable state. She wanted to be there for him the way he had been there for her over the last 3 years, and the way he so gallantly tried to defuse the situation that morning. Firstly, my darling, are you even sure that they know about you? Do you know for sure that that was the reason why they are there? Aurelie was the voice of reason. Rita had always been a strong pragmatic soul, but something had changed in her over the last few years. Rita became more concerned about what others thought of her than what she thought of herself. No, Rita sighed finally. She wasn't at all sure, but her anxiety flared up nevertheless. Then it's time to think with a clear mind. Keep working and doing all that you can. In time you'll know the reason they are there, and by that time you would have figured out a plan of action, Aurelie said. You're right. I can't jump to conclusions and respond in the first negative way I can think of. I'll just try to sort out my mind. I don't want anyone finding out that I'm in the country illegally. If anyone finds out. Rita's voice trailed off. She wiped her tears and closed her eyes. She didn't want to think about it anymore. What the hell? Rita was so frightened by the voice that she leapt out of her skin and dropped the phone. She whipped her head around, her eyes wide, and her heart racing wildly inside her. By the open door of her cottage stood a very shocked and a very angry George Ainsworth.
Chapter 3. Mr. Ainsworth, Rita squeaked. She picked up the phone and placed it back down on the receiver. She wasn't thinking, and didn't even remember that her mother was on the other line. She'd call her back later. Right now she was too worried about George and what it was that he could have heard. What was that all about, Rita? His voice was raised slightly and he was glaring at her. Rita recognized that tone for whenever he had gotten in a spat with his now ex-wife Julie. I was just talking to my mom. How did you get in here? The door was open. I came here to see if you were feeling better than this morning, but clearly I stumbled on something else. Didn't I? George squared his shoulders and clenched his jaw. Even in anger, he appeared to be regal. Rita didn't know what to say. She wasn't sure everything that he had heard, but it was enough to make him upset. In just a matter of hours, her world was crashing down around her. Mr. Ainsworth would more than likely call the authorities and she would have to go back to Montreal. The one place she was afraid to go back to. Have you nothing to say to me? George said with his teeth still clenched. Rita's mouth opened and closed. She didn't know where to begin. She could either come clean now or continue with her ruse. She would be found out sooner or later. It was best, she felt, for her to be honest with him. I'm not really sure what it is that I can say, Mr. Ainsworth, Rita said. She stood and faced him, but her gaze met the floor. She was silly to think that she could try to be friends with him. They were from completely separate worlds. He was practically royalty, and she was just the housekeeper. Well, from what I gather, you're in this country illegally. Is that true? George said. His voice hadn't softened at all. His temper was flaring, but he was trying to hold it together. Rita already looked ashamed, and he didn't want to frighten her. He just wanted to know the truth. Rita nodded. I see. Well, you know you won't be able to stay here any longer, Rita. Rita's eyes widened when she finally looked up at him. There was no chance to plead her case or to explain what was happening. He was so willing to just let her go. Tears formed in Rita's big brown eyes. George looked away. If he looked at her, then he would have backed down. You've been lying to me for 3 years. You've been in my house and I've let you live on our property. What's going to happen to me when people find out? Is that why the paparazzi was outside today? George asked. I don't know. Rita found her voice finally. A few tears streamed down her cheeks, but she brushed them away with the tips of her fingers. I only guessed that was why they could have been outside today. I panicked and just needed to call my mom. What would have happened if you had been caught? The authorities would have gotten a hold of you. They would no doubt ask me questions about harboring you, and I would have no answers for them. It's too risky. The shares in my company are already going down, and I've been getting negative publicity because of the divorce, George said. He was beside himself. He was pacing back and forth and appeared to be talking more to himself than to Rita. She watched him in her peripheral without actually taking a proper look at him. She didn't want to be fired. She had nowhere else to go. Wait, does Julie know? George stopped suddenly. The thought had just occurred to him. When it came to their duties as husband and wife, Julie had been in charge of everyone they had hired and was responsible for their wages also. If Julie had been the one to pay, then she must have known about Rita's situation. Yes and no, Rita said. She didn't feel like explaining further, but she knew she had to. She was already fired according to him anyways. She knew I wasn't a citizen and that I couldn't pay taxes. She's been paying me with cash since. She didn't ask any questions because I'm good at my job. And what was it that brought you here? I just had to leave, Rita replied. Her eyes were once again brimming with tears. You don't have to be afraid, Rita. I don't think that you hurt anyone. Look at you, you couldn't hurt a fly. Can you tell me why you had to leave? George had calmed down just a bit. He hated making anyone cry. Even when Julie cried, her tears were his kryptonite. He wanted to find rational ways of solving the issues without harsh words, tears, and certainly not violence. He was a businessman even in his regular life. Rita released her words the same way she had let out her tears. There were moments when she allowed them to flow freely, and then times when she held back what she wanted to say. In her mind, she was juggling between letting him know the full story or telling him the bare minimum. When I was 21, I got into a really terrible relationship, she started. She looked up to search George's face. He moved a few steps forward and nodded for her to continue. He was a few years older than me, and I was so excited to have him. He was my first proper boyfriend. It was after school, and he had opened up to me right away. My mother never liked him. She was right all along not to trust him. The tears started again, but Rita shook them away and stood even more boldly upright. Now that she had a chance to tell the full story, she wanted to show that she was braver now than when she was younger. We eventually moved in together. My mother didn't approve and my friends hated him. He was always so snarky and telling me when I could go out or who it was that I could see. He wanted me with him all the time. And if I wasn't with him, he wanted me to be doing things for him. I felt like a prisoner in our little apartment. George's eyebrows raised and then scrunched together. He was getting upset again. But it was clear that he wasn't getting upset with Rita. If there were times I left when he wasn't there would always be someone to report back to him. I felt like I belonged to him. My mother and my friends begged me to leave him, but I didn't know what to do. At that time, I thought I was in love with him. Even after the first time he hit me. Rita's words got tangled in her throat when she started to talk about the abuse. Her tears had turned into full-blown sobs. George walked across the room and over to her. He took Rita in his arms and embraced her. He could feel the pounding of her heart against him. You don't have to say anything else. I understand why you did what you had to do, George said. He could feel that it was uncomfortable for Rita to talk about her past. That was why she had managed to keep it a secret for so long. She had managed to stop crying, but her shoulders still shook. George didn't let her go. He pulled her away from him just enough for him to look into her eyes. Don't worry, Rita. I'm sorry I snapped at you. No, I understand. You didn't know. She walked away from him to get a paper towel from the kitchen. She wiped away her tears before collapsing onto the couch. It had been an exhausting day for her. She had her usual work to do, but she had spent a lot of that day overthinking and crying. She didn't know where she was going to be tomorrow. George perked up suddenly. Rita eyed him. Why was he getting so cheery all of a sudden? She could practically see the wheels turning in his head. Rita, what if I told you that I knew a way for you to stay in America? Married. Jose and Rita were in the family room of the mansion the next morning. Jose wasn't scheduled to work that day, but Rita had called him with some very interesting news. That's what he said, Rita replied. She was taking the curtains off of the rods. She needed to climb on a ladder to get to them. Jose was down below and taking the curtains from her once she was able to maneuver and bring them down. Rita told Jose about the night before. After she had finished crying, George Ainsworth had proposed an idea, and that meant proposing to her. It'll make everyone happy, he had said. Proposing to her meant that she would be able to get a green card and legally stay in the country. It also meant the press would have their juicy gossip without trying to sniff around too much. He hadn't worked out all of the details, but he assured her that she shouldn't worry. George had left earlier that day to get in touch with some very important officials. It would mean their marriage would be quick, legal, and very hush-hush until they were ready to go public. Rita explained all of this to him once she got off the ladder and dragged it to another side of the room in order to get the last set of curtains. So you'll just be married? Jose said with a bit of an exasperated huff. He was still floored by the news. Well, we'd get divorced later, of course. Of course. Jose echoed quickly. It would take a few months to finalize my papers, but once that process is over, I'll be a citizen and I won't have to worry about the press or my ex-boyfriend or anything, Rita said. She felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She had thanked Mr. Ainsworth profusely before he left, and called her mother right after with the news. Then it's settled, Jose said. A smile was forming on his face. You're going to be Mrs. Marguerite Ainsworth. Rita and George were set to be married the following Saturday. It had become quite awkward for Rita being in the house, but not George. George, with the way he was, treated this like another business meeting or transaction. He kept reassuring Rita, and he had brought a lot of paperwork to the house for her to read and to sign. He had even brought a prenuptial agreement to make it seem even more legitimate. George had told the officials that it was a secret wedding because they had secretly been in love for a few months. He didn't want anyone getting wind of the story. He knew that his friends were trustworthy, but he also didn't want them to know Rita's secret because it wasn't his secret to tell. This is the last of the paperwork, I promise. George had just come home from work. It was Friday night, the night before their wedding. Rita was finished with her work for the day, but George had given her a call earlier that day to tell her not to go back to her cottage just yet. She was sitting out on the lanai with her hands clasped over her lap. She had been pacing about in the garden, but after a while she just wanted to sit with her thoughts. Getting married really is like owning a company. There are so many contracts to sign, and even money's involved. Whatever happened to being married for love? Rita said. She was speaking more to herself than to George, but he answered anyway. Sometimes love doesn't last. We're so caught up with pride and status and money that we lose sight of the people around us who love us and who we love. But after all of this, you can do what you'd like. You won't have to feel so cooped up on the property anymore, George said. He handed her a pen and a certificate for her to sign. Rita read through it quickly and with a dainty hand swirled her signature at the bottom of the page. That's very true, Rita agreed. She was thinking about how George was with Julie before things had started to go south with them. She had always fantasized about a man loving her the way George had once loved Julie. But the love had made him cold. If he couldn't find a way to make any situation a pragmatic one that involved paperwork and business transactions, then he didn't really like to discuss it. Helping Rita out was the warmest he had been since the divorce came through. He spent a bit of time each night talking to Rita about their plan and what they were going to do once they were married. Please stay in the mansion tonight. You can choose any of the guest rooms that you'd like. We can get ready together in the morning, George said. He reached out his hand and Rita rested hers in his. He gave her hand a light squeeze as if to tell her that he had everything under control, and she didn't have to worry anymore. The squeeze filled her with a new kind of strength. She looked into his eyes and nodded. They were having a silent conversation with their bodies. George had gone up to bed, and Rita was up the stairs and down the hall in one of the guest rooms to do the same. She couldn't help but feel excited and grateful. She had always wanted to be married. This wasn't at all what she had ever had in mind. But now all that was in her head was the fact that she could be free from her fears and her worries that she hadn't quite left back in Montreal. Rita's mind wandered to George for a time. He had never talked about the wedding itself. He was busy with the paperwork and the legal aspects of it that she didn't even know what she was to expect the next morning. She thought of how handsome he looked the other morning in a tuxedo. His shoulders were broad, and he was so tall and charismatic with the way he moved and spoke. Rita put her head on her pillow and fell asleep. "How's my darling?" George was in a three-piece suit, but it wasn't a tuxedo. He had a bouquet of flowers in his hand. Rita stepped into the room in a short summer dress adorned with polka dots of various colors and sizes. Her hair was swirled into a bun, and a small golden headband was around her head. "You look absolutely ravishing," George said when he saw her. Rita didn't recognize this place. It looked like a larger version of her cottage, but she could smell the sea and knew they were on a beachfront property somewhere. George gave her the flowers and lowered his face to hers. He planted a kiss on both of her cheeks, gently moving her face when he kissed her. He pulled her chin up for their eyes to meet, and he kissed her on the lips. The kiss was warm and inviting. There was a surge of energy and longing within Rita that she hadn't felt for many years.
Oh no, it's about to get hot.
But we can't put this on YouTube as their policies don't allow it. I'm sorry.
But check the description of this video to join the exclusive Romancely Audio Velvet membership and get all steamy scenes for this story and more. Believe me, every sweaty detail is described.
If you're already an Inner Circle member, the love scene reference is The Billionaire's Housekeeper, Chapter 3, Love Scene 1.
Okay, back to the story.
"I'm here," she called out. "I'm sorry to wake you, but the minister will be here at 10. "I thought you ought to get ready," George said. Rita nodded, forgetting that he wasn't in the room to see her. "Yes, I'll be right out." Rita realized that she had no idea what to wear. If this was a wedding, then she wanted to at least look decent for it. She tore out of bed, almost tripping on the blankets, and went into the bathroom to brush her teeth. She took the quickest shower of her life and put on a clean white bathrobe. It was almost like George was psychic, because he knocked on the guest room door just then. "Are you decent?" he asked through the door. Rita didn't quite know how to answer that. Did he expect her to be dressed? "I think I am. I'm only in a robe though," she admitted. "Would it be all right if I came in?" George asked. Rita moved over to the door and unlocked it. She held it ajar in case she was supposed to be ready. George wasn't alone. There were two women and a man standing a bit behind George. "Rita, this is Cassandra, Meryl, and Luke. They'll be helping you get dressed today." Rita didn't know what to say. Meryl had a hanger with a long black bag attached to it. Rita could only assume that was to be her dress. Cassandra and Luke both had black trunks that they kept on wheels with them. "Oh," was all Rita could think to say. She opened the door and let them in. "George was right," Cassandra said when George had closed the door behind him. "You are absolutely stunning. I don't even know why I'm here." Cassandra was plump and cheerful. Luke was quieter, but he was already undoing Rita's hair and playing around with it. Her hair was very curly, and he hummed ever so often trying to find what to do with it. "No time," Meryl said. She sounded impatient, but it was more panic than anger. "Ever thought of cutting your hair?" "Sugar?" Luke asked. Rita had never thought about it. She wanted to try something bold and different. "No, but I trust your judgment," Rita said. Luke got started right away. He was an artist with his scissors and brush. He cut Rita's hair into a short bob and used a hairdryer. Cassandra got to her makeup right away, and Meryl sat patiently on the bed waiting for everyone to be finished. When Cassandra had put the final touches of makeup on Rita, Meryl unzipped the black bag. Rita was mesmerized. The dress was short and off-white. It was a corset top adorned with feathers, with a hint of modesty about it by the lace that covered her chest and went up her neck. It tapered out from her waist and puffed out. There were bright red shoes with small feathers on the heels as well. Rita was so excited to see how she looked. She was considering going to the mirror, but Meryl shrieked, "No time!" again, and they were all out the door. Luke had put on a small hat and netted veil over Rita's face. When they were downstairs, they all gave her a hug and ushered her to the lanai where Jose would be waiting for her. She stepped out and gasped. There were a few chairs outside with a few guests. She didn't recognize anyone except an Ainsworth. George's mother was there. Jose stood at the foot of the stairs with a bouquet in his hand. "You look gorgeous. Love the cut," he whispered to her and gave her the flowers. No one had seen that she was there, but the music started suddenly. The few guests rose and turned around to see her, and gave her a huge smile and clapped silently. Rita and Jose walked down the aisle until she could finally see Mr. Ainsworth. He had his back turned to her, but when he knew she was close enough, he turned around. George's knees almost buckled when he saw her, and Rita was the same. Maybe it had been her dream from the night before, but now all she could do was think about the man in front of her. The man looking at her like she was the only woman in the world. Jose kissed her cheek and then moved her closer towards George Ainsworth, her future husband.
Chapter 4. It was a beautiful ceremony, and sad. The other guests had left, including Jose. She, Rita, and George were sitting out on the lanai drinking some champagne. The reception was a short and simple one. There was a live band playing soft jazz outside, and the couple shared a few dances. Rita had to keep reminding herself that this was just an act. They needed everything to be as real as possible, and to take photographs to satisfy the paparazzi. They had to make their romance seem real for their plan to work. "Thank you," Rita said. "It felt almost completely real to me," and cackled. She took a sip of champagne. Rita hadn't had the chance to ask George who all of the guests were, or what his mother was doing there. Now that everyone was gone, they could talk freely. "Don't look so surprised, dear," an Ainsworth said while patting on Rita's knee. "Who do you think got that dress of yours?" Rita always liked George's mother. She was very matter-of-fact, and she was also extremely funny. She had never treated Rita like the help, but more like one of her own friends. She didn't visit very often. Rita enjoyed whenever she did. Rita's questions for the day were starting to be answered. "Forgive me, I'm a little bit tipsy, so I may say some stupid things," and said. George was quiet after the guests had left. He was sitting on the other side of the lanai and brooding. "Oh, George, don't be a sourpuss. Come over here and talk to your mother and your wife," and cackled again. Rita couldn't help but smile when and turned to wink at her. "You're gorgeous, honey. That haircut suits you. I may need to pay Luke extra." "You talk too much," George said when he finally came over to them and sat across from Rita and his mother. "And you talk too little," and said. She waved a finger like she had just had an epiphany. "I'm going into town. I'll ask Frank to take me. I think I'll give you guys a couple of hours to talk things through." And got up and glided to the open French doors and out of sight. "Did you like it?" George asked when he was sure his mother was gone. "It was all very beautiful, and very real." "Thank you," Rita said. "Thank you too. Anyone who can put up with my mom's silly antics for more than an hour has to be a saint," he laughed. Rita remembered that Julie and had never gotten along. And always had a snarky remark to say about her, or she'd roll her eyes while Julie talked. She never tried to hide how she felt, and Rita thought that was very admirable. "I'm no saint." "I really like your mother," Rita said. George smiled at that. It was nice to hear someone in his life say that. "I called a few men to move some of your things to the mansion. We can't have you living in a separate home from me now, can we?" Rita nodded in agreement. She still felt so strange now after the dream she had had, but she was warming up and trying to be more comfortable. George stood and moved to sit beside her. That haircut really does suit you. He brushed a hand against the tips of her hair, gently grazing her cheek as well. It wasn't meant to be sensual, but Rita blushed nonetheless. She was about to speak when she heard the front door open. George's mother may have forgotten something and had come back to the house to get it. Rita and George turned to face the French doors leading back into the house expectantly. They had both been assuming the same thing. You who? Is anybody here? George's eyes widened and he shot Rita a panicked look. That wasn't an at all. He knew the voice right away, and now so did Rita. Where can a lady get a nice stiff drink around here? The voice was looming closer and closer to the door. Oh, there you are. I figured the lovebirds would be out here. The tall and slim figure came to the open doorway and leaned against the wall with her arms crossed. She was all legs, but today she had wrapped herself in a fur coat. There was a devious smile on her face, and her icy blue eyes flexed in the light of the setting sun. Rita couldn't speak. She didn't know the right words to say. But the figure's eyes were now fixated on her, and Rita couldn't take her eyes off of Julie Ainsworth. Julie? What the hell are you doing here? George hissed. He was standing now. Julie looked cool and calm. What? Your new ex-wife can't get an invite to your secret wedding? Looks like I missed it anyway. Julie's voice sounded bored. How did you find out? You don't think that Paul Westman wouldn't get in touch with me? Julie sounded almost outraged. Paul Westman was one of the people who had helped George finalize the paperwork for Rita's and his wedding. Paul was a wealthy man and his brother was in public office. Paul was happy to help George because they had been friends for many years, but George had forgotten that the reason they were was because of Julie and her parents. Paul had told Julie about the wedding. What did Paul tell you? George eyed his ex-wife suspiciously. Paul told me that my louse of an ex-husband was already getting remarried. I didn't believe it until he showed me the prenup. I got in a tizzy when I read who you were marrying and had to come and see for myself. Julie took off the fur coat and tossed it on the nearest chair. She was in all white as well. She had on pants that flared at the bottom and a sleeveless white blouse with pearls as buttons on it. She folded her arms over her chest again and her eyes danced back and forth between the two of them. Hey Rita, you look nice. An obviously fake smile formed over her face. I gotta say that I expected something like this from a son of a bitch like George, but never from you. Julie.I. Rita started. Julie held up her hand to stop Rita from finishing. Oh, you can have him, honey, Julie said. I just know my husband is using you for something. Once he gets what he wants, then it's on to the next young pretty girl. I can't say I'm surprised. I knew there was something going on with you two before I moved out, Julie continued. Rita was about to open her mouth to tell Julie that she was wrong. But George took her by the hand before she could speak. Rita got to her feet and the two of them stood side by side and hand in hand. I gotta say, you've done an excellent job of keeping the press away. If Paul hadn't told me, I would have found out on the cover of some gossip magazine. How humiliating would that have been for me? Julie pouted. All of her actions were fake. There wasn't a drop of sincerity on her face or in her voice. She sounded like she was toying with them, and Rita didn't like that at all. She wanted to tell Julie to leave, but she still didn't feel like it was her place to. She kept her mouth shut and squeezed George's hand. Go home, Julie, the voice startled Rita. It was Anne. She had come back and was now standing at the door behind Julie. Julie scoffed and turned around to face Anne. You have no business in this house or with these two anymore. Save yourself the embarrassment and just go home. Julie looked like she was about to protest, but she turned again to look at George and Rita. She saw the two of them, still in their wedding clothes, and her eyes moved down to the two of them holding hands. She looked defeated and almost sad. That was the first real emotion she had shown since coming to the house. It disappeared immediately and she sneered at them. Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you, Rita. I'll be back. I left some things in the house, and I'm going to call someone to pick them up in the next week. I'll be out of your hair, and you both can ride off into the sunset together. She bowed dramatically and picked up her fur coat. She flung it over her arm and started to make her way inside and off of the lanai. Julie, one more thing, and Ainsworth said. She pursed her lips with a look of annoyance. Julie didn't speak, but she paused to wait for what Anne had to say to her. I'm going to need your keys. Rita was trying to get used to all of the changes in the last 2 weeks. She was too nervous to turn on the TV or read any newspaper or magazine. She was sure the press had been talking about her secret garden wedding with George Ainsworth, and she didn't want to know about any of the stories they could have possibly concocted. She was now living in the mansion, but sometimes during the day, she found herself wandering back out to her little cottage and sit outside to just enjoy her little space. The cottage was where she knew the most. Being in a huge mansion and locking herself away in her guest room felt isolating. Being at her cottage felt a bit more freeing to Rita. It was a place she felt was her own. Rita continued with her work and kept the mansion as clean as she could. That somehow made George uncomfortable. He knew that their marriage arrangement was temporary and strictly to help Rita sort out what had happened to her in her past, but to him it felt strange that people knew that his new wife was still housekeeping. George, of course, went to work as usual. Nothing would stop him from his busy lifestyle, but he still felt concerned for Rita. He was going to hire new staff so that she wouldn't have to worry too much about work. I'm not sure what to do with myself in the days, Rita admitted to him one morning. They were in the kitchen. George was already awake and ready for work. He was drinking a coffee and had a panini and a half-eaten bowl of muesli on the kitchen island in front of him. Beatrice hadn't fixed him breakfast, and it almost made Rita smile that George had taken the time to make his own breakfast. The panini smelt divine. There's loads to do, George said, trying to sound bright. He honestly had no idea how Rita liked to spend her free time. The new staff was coming that day, and George wanted Rita to let them know what it was they would need to do. She would also be in charge of how and when to pay them. She didn't like that she wasn't working or doing anything with her time. The last thing she wanted was to feel like some billionaire's plaything. Like what? Rita said. She eyed him and raised her eyebrow. The look on her face made George chuckle a little. They had spent the last few weeks talking at any chance they could. Rita was taking her time to open up. She hadn't let George in on any of the important events of her life, but they now had a vague concept of who each other was. She even felt more comfortable with calling him by his first name. She would always pause before saying it, and that made him smile every time. You can frolic in the garden a bit. You can watch any movie you'd like, I have an insane collection. You can do some yoga, or work out, or just, I don't know. What do you like to do, Rita? George asked. Rita used to do a lot before she graduated college. Her ex had made it impossible for her to keep up with her hobbies. She loved track and field and being outside. She was also extremely affectionate towards animals, but that didn't mean those were things that could fill up her day. I suppose I could do some of those things. I like the idea of being outside. I like to explore new places and maybe paint. You paint? No, not at all, Rita laughed. But it would be nice to try new things. I've spent the last several years of my life having my life controlled by men. Where I went and what I was doing. Now that I feel like I have some freedom, I'm not even sure what to do with it. Rita couldn't believe that she had been so open about her feelings just then. They were true though. She would still look to George to get the okay for going into certain rooms in the house, or when she ate, or even when she wanted to excuse herself to go to her cottage or spend time in her own energy. You won't have to worry about that anymore, Rita. George brushed a few strands of Rita's curly bob out of her face. He looked deeply into her eyes. I said I would take care of things, and I plan to keep that promise. Please, feel free to do whatever you'd like. Just that you know, avoid setting the whole damn house on fire. Rita laughed again. She had been doing that more often since the wedding. George had a very strange sense of humor that was very matter-of-fact. Rita just enjoyed being in the company of someone who wasn't asking too much of her. George downed the rest of his coffee and rose from his stool. He took a panini in his hand and wrapped it up in a paper towel. The staff should be here by 10. I've let Gordon know to expect them. Enjoy your day, Rita, he said and stepped out of the kitchen. Rita could hear the clicking of his shoes on the hardwood floor of the kitchen change into a gentle tap on the marble floor of the living area and entranceway, and then the final sound of a door opening and closing, and then George was gone. Rita felt even smaller now that he wasn't there. The house was so large, but there were no people there aside from Beatrice. Since Julie had taken her furniture, walking into certain rooms sounded like the house was haunted. The space felt hollow, and there was always the sense that something was missing. Rita took up the plates and the mug from the island and put them in the sink. She started to wash off and rinse the items to put them in the dishwasher. She was going to make breakfast for herself. She wasn't sure what to eat, but she eventually decided on eggs, sausages, and some yogurt. Her mother was the one who taught her how to cook, and she would have had something more extravagant, but she was still minding her PS and QS around Ainsworth Mansion. George would have rolled his eyes and told her to eat whatever she'd like, but she still wasn't used to doing anything she'd like for herself. She was hoping in time that would change. Rita sat down to eat at the same stool that George had been in that morning. There was a small stack of newspapers on the island. She had been avoiding the news for so long, and even asked George not to say anything if he saw something about them in the newspaper. But today she was curious. She picked up one of the rolled newspapers and looked through until she got to where she thought any stories about George could be. There didn't seem to be anything at first until she got to the third page. It wasn't the largest story on the page, but the title was bold enough for it to be noticed right away. Billionaire marries housekeeper, former wife claims she knew about the affair. Rita's blood ran cold. Julie had spoken to the press. Now the story would be that Rita was a homewrecker and that George was a playboy. This wasn't going to help him with his business. She wasn't sure how he ever thought that potentially ruining his career was worth helping her. She wanted to know if he was just a caring person who didn't want anything bad to happen to the people in his life, or if she was what he cared about. She read a bit of the article but stopped halfway. It was too much negativity for the day. Rita folded the paper and tossed it back onto the counter. She finished eating her breakfast and cleaned up a bit. She couldn't think of anything to do before the new cleaning staff arrived, so she called Jose to come over. He didn't live too far away, and spending time with him was just what Rita needed. Jose would be a welcome distraction from her thoughts and what she had seen in the newspaper earlier. Rita waited in the living room. The guard would let Jose in, but she wanted to be close enough to the door. She was feeling a new kind of anxious. There was something about this that excited her. The rumors would pass, she knew, but she also felt like she was untouchable. George Ainsworth had kept his promise so far. The doorbell chimed and echoed throughout the house. The high ceilings and marble floor made the acoustics of the room so unique that the sound of the bells floated about like an aroma, tickling the internal walls of the ears of anyone in that room. "Good morning, Mrs. Ainsworth," Jose bowed dramatically, flamboyantly swishing his arms and bending forward as low as he would go. "Will you be doing this every time I answer the door?" "God, I hope so," he said. "Where is everybody?" "The new staff should be here in about an hour. Beatrice is in town getting some food for later. So I'm all by my lonesome." If this were a movie, this would be the part where they would have a montage of you wearing the former Mrs. Ainsworth's furs, Jose laughed. He and Rita walked into the kitchen and sat down on the stools in front of the island. "Speaking of Julie, how is the little devil?" Rita smacked Jose playfully, but he just shrugged. "We haven't really heard from her since the wedding. She said she was gonna come back to get the rest of her things. But she hasn't called and nobody has come for them," Rita said. "Do you think she's gonna try to sabotage you and Mr. A?" "She's starting to already," Rita said. She let out an exasperated sigh. That was partially why she called Jose. She needed to tell him what was going on in her world now, but she also just needed to have some fun with her friends so that she could take her mind off of everything that was going on around her. "How so?" "It's been awfully quiet out front since you guys released those wedding photos. You looked very Dorothy Dandridge, by the way, just thought I should let you know. But I haven't seen any paparazzi out front in about a week." Rita's shoulders collapsed and she put her forehead down on the kitchen island. "They haven't been out front because they've been so busy talking to Julie. She apparently knew about the affair that we were having from before their divorce." "What affair?" Jose asked. He knew Rita better than anyone, and he knew that the most George and Rita had spoken was from just before they agreed to get married in order to save Rita from being found out and getting deported. Jose pulled his phone out of his pocket and started going through it. He was probably looking for any word about Rita and George. "That's what I read in the paper this morning," Rita said. "Julie has been talking to the press." "I didn't read the article, the only thing I saw was the title, and I didn't think I could stand reading anymore." "She what?" Jose said. He sounded frustrated. He was never a fan of Julie Ainsworth to begin with. "Yeah. She said in the paper that George and I have been having an affair. I don't know if I should even bring it up to him. It could be that he knows already. Which means he sacrificed so much just to keep me safe," Rita said. Guilt overwhelmed her. She stayed put with her arms on the counter and her head resting on top of the backs of her hands. Jose rubbed her back and continued to scroll through his phone. He stopped scrolling suddenly. He seemed deep in concentration, like he was now reading something. "Which article did you say it was?" "The article that says that Julie Ainsworth speaks up about husband's affair or something like that," Rita said, sitting up on the stool to give Jose a better look. "I see some articles that have that. But there's something else." He paused and shot a nervous glance at Rita. Rita didn't respond. She knew Jose had a knack for being melodramatic, but she didn't want to say anything. She needed for him to tell her what was going on. "Rita, one of the articles here says that your marriage is a sham. They're saying that your nuptials aren't legal."
Chapter 5. "I didn't think I needed to tell you. I just thought that you knew," George said. He was back from work later than usual. Rita couldn't sleep and had been pacing around the house. Jose had kept her company for the entire morning, and for some of the afternoon until he had to leave to tend to someone's garden on another side of town. Rita didn't speak to Beatrice much unless it was about swapping recipes or talking about Beatrice's grandchildren in grade school. And since the new cleaning staff had arrived, she hadn't had much time to herself or her thoughts. She let them know all that needed to be done around the house and kept as much of a lookout for them as possible. She was still technically employed by Mr. Ainsworth after all. George had come home and found Rita absent-mindedly walking back and forth from the entrance hall, to the living room, down to the dining hall, to the kitchen and back up again. She had paced back and forth twice before even noticing that he had come through the door. "I've never been married before," Rita hissed her response. She flung her arms up in exasperation before crossing them over her chest. She had too much on her mind to keep still, and her foot tapped on the marble floor of the entranceway. George sighed and moved toward the stairs. He motioned for Rita to follow as he ascended. "My divorce hasn't fully come through, and there's alimony and other things to consider. The wedding took place and we have the documents, but nothing will be considered legal for another month and a half. Didn't you read the fine print?" George shook his head. He headed toward his room as he spoke. Rita wasn't sure if she should follow. She was only ever in George's room to clean it, and over the last 2 weeks she felt uneasy whenever she was in there. This would be the first time that she would be in George's room with him in it. "I skimmed through everything. I thought it was typical wedding jargon." Rita hissed again. Her voice cracked in panic, and that made George laugh. "I'm really sorry, Rita. I just thought that you knew. That's why we haven't gone out in public or anything yet." "So you've been keeping me locked up like a princess in a tower?" Rita asked. She didn't sound too happy about that, but now her voice was more tired than panicky. It had been a trying last few weeks, and Rita wanted answers without having to spend days at a time worrying about the question. George put his briefcase down on his bed before he answered. He turned and moved over to her. "Like a queen of a castle," he said and added. "But nothing like that. I wanted to get the public's reaction first, and I wanted to keep you safe." George smiled down at Rita. That made something inside her tingle. It reminded her of her dream the night before the wedding. She shook away the thought by blinking rapidly and turning her head to avoiding his gaze. "I promised not to let anything happen to you. I'm sure they know that our marriage won't be legal for long, but now they're more focused on the idea about our apparent affair," George said. He smirked. "And how does that make you feel?" Rita asked him curiously. She didn't want to ask him flat out what it was he thought was worse, the notion that he was a cheating son of a bitch, or the fact that his marriage vows couldn't be upheld for the next few months. George looked at Rita for a long time. He looked like he was just about to soften his expression and smile again, but something inside him changed his mind. He breathed in deeply, and his expression turned hard once again before he answered. "Well, I guess I'll figure that out at some point. I don't feel much of anything right now, other than tired from work, and tired of people hounding me for answers," George said flatly. "Oh," Rita said. She wasn't sure what else she could say. She also didn't know if she should leave or stay. She averted her eyes when George had turned around and started undoing his tie. "Things will work themselves out, Rita? You just have to keep trusting me," George said once his tie was off. "But I think it's about time you stopped hiding." Rita finally looked back up at him when he said that. She wasn't sure what he meant by that, but she was hoping it didn't involve her having to talk to anyone about her life. She wasn't sure how many interviews George had done, but she knew that wasn't her kind of scene. "Don't look so worried," George laughed. He took off his shoes and stepped into his bathroom for a moment. He came back out with his shirt completely unbuttoned. Rita wasn't sure how many times that night she had felt embarrassed or felt the need to look away from him. She backed away slowly and felt for the handle of the door behind her. She knew she had overstayed her welcome in his bedroom. She didn't want to be there when he was fully changed. Her face grew warm, and she was just about to turn around and leave his room when he spoke up again. "Good night, Rita." "Good night, George," she said. "Rita. About not keeping you hiding." George started. Rita was halfway out the door. She paused for a moment with her hand still on the handle. She waited for George to speak, but it was clear he was changing. She didn't dare turn around even though she knew that she wanted to. Her face got even warmer at the thoughts racing in her mind. "What's that, George?" she said when he hadn't said anything. "I was just thinking. On Friday night. I'm going to take you out to dinner." The next few days went by in a blur. The cleaning staff came promptly at 10 and completed their work by 5. Rita kept a watchful eye over them, but they were really great at what they did, and after a while, She spent most of her day going about her business. She avoided the paper and any news on TV like the plague. She knew George said not to worry too much about what was going on, but she couldn't expect him to be her superhero. He could only do so much. She just didn't know where the boundaries were, and just how much she should be doing for herself. She tried not to think about it. She was nervous enough already because of dinner. Right now, Rita and George were situated at a 5-star restaurant. It seemed like it was even beyond 5 stars. There were beautiful dim globes that seemed to be floating around in the air above the tables. The tables were all round with 2 or more seats depending on the size of the table. The tablecloth was a dark silk, and all of the china and utensils were spotless. Rita wondered if the people who owned the restaurant went to buy new utensils and plates every day for the new patrons, but she was sure that that was impossible. It was a French restaurant that Rita couldn't remember the name of. Every member of the waitstaff was the same height with dark hair pulled back in a bun or held down with a lot of gel. It was like an army of culinary experts. I wonder if all the chefs in the kitchen look just like the waiters and waitresses, Rita joked. She leaned over the table so that George could hear her. He laughed at that and nodded. I noticed that too. It's like a clone army. I hope they're only armed with breadsticks. Ah, but breadsticks can be deadly if the crust is right. Rita winked. George laughed again before taking a sip of his scotch. Rita had been too shy to order any alcohol. She hadn't had a drink in years, and she preferred it that way. George had taken the liberty of ordering a bottle of wine, but promised he wouldn't pressure Rita to have any. They had been silent for most of the night. Rita knew that it was because she was nervous, and because George Ainsworth seemed to prefer quiet company. Since he spent a lot of time brooding and working, he probably wasn't at all sure what to talk about with Rita. He had sent her a message earlier that day telling her to be ready for 7 and not a minute after. Rita had gotten ready in the guest room, and George was waiting at the foot of the stairs, already dressed. Rita was in a short, tight-fitting red dress that was off the shoulder and had a unique black pattern snaking down the back of it. She had on black heels and black jewelry. She put her short, curly bob behind her ears. Her cheekbones seemed to glow under the lights that floated above them. George was in a dark blue shirt and a black blazer with matching black slacks and shoes. The maitre d' had taken the blazer before sitting them down at their table. You look nice, Rita said. It was strange for her to try to maintain good conversation. She was so used to being seen and not heard around the house that looking into the eyes of her former employer now filled her with a new kind of fear that almost made her bold. Thank you. You too, George said, clearing his throat. He looked down at his menu. Rita couldn't help but smile. She looked down so that there was no way he could notice. Maybe it was the dream she had had about him or wishful thinking, but it was possible now that George was just as nervous as she was. She didn't want to make assumptions, though. This situation could get way over both of their heads. This dinner was a reason for them to be seen in public together. That was what George had hinted at the night when he had asked her to follow him into his room. What are you thinking? George asked. You look very deep in thought. Everything okay? I'm fine, Rita breathed. It was still so much getting used to, going from being a housekeeper to dining at a 5-star restaurant. It seemed so normal, like it was a logical next step. She knew it would all be over in a flash. In 3 years they could get divorced and she would be allowed to stay in America. To be honest, I was thinking about our situation. Why such a beautiful restaurant? Is it to make sure the paparazzi take a good look at us? And what about the next 3 years? That's quite a lot of questions, George admitted. Well, first, I brought you to this restaurant because I know I've never taken Julie here. I didn't want you to feel like a caged bird in the mansion. I wanted to take you somewhere that I knew wouldn't be too distracting, to really get a chance to talk and start to get to know each other. As for the next 3 years? Shit, I don't know, Rita. That's what tonight is for. It's a start, he continued. Rita understood. It was nice of him to invite her out. This didn't look like the place for any sleazy reporters to be around taking pictures. George was right. This really was an intimate setting. They could enjoy each other's company without having to whisper or to compete with deafening music. It was the perfect ambience for a first dinner. Thank you for tonight. It's really nice to be out, Rita said. George nodded to acknowledge her, but he didn't speak. He was eyeing her curiously across from the table. George never thought he would ever have gotten the chance to know Rita. He knew he was always at his company working, or spending time with Julie. Rita was usually in the background. They only exchanged a few pleasantries or work-related conversation. Now that she was there in front of him with her face beaming, and her hair cut elegantly, and in an outfit that made her look like royalty, he wasn't even sure what to say to her. There was something that drew him in, but he was cautious. This wasn't something that was real, he had to keep reminding himself. He had just gotten a divorce from someone who he thought he would be with forever. Then everything changed. Julie changed. And yes, he had changed as well. George stopped to think about the times when they had been happy, and tried to recall the exact moment when the changes became so obvious that they both knew things weren't going to work out. "Have you been here before?" Rita asked, pulling George out of his thoughts. She could see that he was pensive, but she didn't want to lose his attention just yet. "Only once. It was a business meeting, so there was more drinking than eating involved," George said. "So the business world really is just like the movies, huh?" "I'd say so, yes. You won't see me snorting a line of cocaine on a stripper's tits or anything though," George joked. "Ha! As your new wife, George Ainsworth, I may have to protest," Rita started. "Drugs are very bad for you. But the stripper is?" George laughed, but he was utterly bemused. "Doing her job. We all do what we have to do to survive. In the movies, the stripper is never the one doing coke, you notice?" Rita pointed out. George considered it and nodded in agreement. It was so strange to him that down beneath the pious demeanor, Rita had a silly, wicked sense of humor. The little tinge of French in her accent made even her more serious jokes sound adorable. And George found himself leaning in closer to her more often just to catch all that she was saying. The food they ordered had arrived finally, as well as the bottle of wine. George poured some for himself and set it down on the table. If Rita wanted any, he was sure that she would let him know. "This tastes amazing," Rita squeaked with her mouth still half full. Her meal had the perfect ratio of savory and sweet. It was like tasting different colors of the rainbow against the darkest patterns of the night sky. She took another bite and closed her eyes to savor the taste. George smiled at her when she closed her eyes. She looked like she was in heaven, and watching her now almost made him feel what it was that she was feeling. "Try some," Rita said when she opened her eyes. She took up a forkful and put an open hand underneath the fork so that she could catch whatever spilled. She moved her hands forward, and George leaned in to meet her halfway. "That is excellent," George said approvingly. "Good choice." Rita giggled and thanked him. "Now you," George said. He picked up some of his meal and gently fed Rita with it. The flavors exploded into her mouth again. "That's wonderful too," Rita said with her eyes wide. She eyed her food, then George's, and then searched George's face. "Would you trade?" Rita asked sheepishly. That made George roar with laughter. He was just about to pick up his plate when Rita held up a finger and then dug into her food again. She took a bite and studied the flavors and textures in her mouth. "Nope, I changed my mind," she giggled. "Bon appetit." George found himself stealing more and more glances at Rita as they ate. They didn't speak, but it wasn't for lack of anything to say. This was one of those comfortable silences that they both seemed to enjoy. If Rita caught George looking at her, she would offer him a kind smile and go back to her meal. George noticed that she frequently closed her eyes. She was always so focused on whatever it was that she was doing, and he couldn't help but admire that. "Are you open to talking a bit about your childhood?" George asked. He was just about to pour himself a second glass of wine when a waiter came up and did so for him. George thanked him, but Rita shook her head when he was about to pour her a glass as well. She liked having her wits about her. She was never too fond of alcohol. She had seen what it did to her father and even to her ex-boyfriend who she had run away from. He had been under the influence of all kinds of things while Rita had unfortunately been under his influence for many years. "My childhood was pretty textbook. Girl is born, one parent is an alcoholic, parents split up, and girl grows up having a jaded sense of what it means to really be loved by a man," Rita said. It was silly to her that George was the one that was drinking, but she was the one spewing seemingly drunken thoughts to him. George shot her a sympathetic look and extended his hand for her to take. She hesitated, but then placed her small hand in his. He was warm, and his warmth was surging through her now. She wasn't at all sure how far into her childhood she wanted to go. It was too much for having dinner for the first time, but she knew that she was truly enjoying herself, and there was a part of her that wanted all of this to be real. Her heart lifted when he squeezed her hand just a bit, and the two of them stared at each other for a long time. "We can talk about something else if you'd like," George finally said. Rita breathed a sigh of relief. "Good. I don't want to talk much about the past. I'd like to talk about the present and the possibility of the future," Rita said. "Go on," George said. "I guess I just want to know if you're happy right now. I mean, at this very moment. With all that's been going on over the last few weeks." "I'm a bit overwhelmed," George admitted. Rita nodded her head and looked away. She felt silly. She was living in a fantasy world where she was no longer the housekeeper and Mr. Ainsworth could possibly love her beyond the paperwork and the wedding. George squeezed her hand again and she waited for him to continue. "Work always has me overwhelmed. But now the press is snooping around not just in my business but my personal life. People like to talk a lot. They'll get their fill and believe whatever they'd like anyway. I try not to pay much attention, but when there are reporters constantly in my face when I'm trying to focus on work, it gets pretty jarring." "Do you wish we hadn't done this?" Rita asked quietly. George felt a cold shiver over his heart and he swallowed before answering. "I hate to lie, but I don't regret it. I did what I knew was right, and I'd do it again if you'd have me." "You mean marry you?" "Yes, Rita. I mean marry me," George said. He didn't know what came over him. Maybe it was the way Rita looked that evening, or just being able to talk to her without sensing that there would be anger heading his way. But he was glad that Rita was very welcome company. She had made him laugh tonight, and they were able to share a comfortable silence. They had a way of communicating through touch or whenever their eyes met. There was a connection that neither of them could deny, but also one neither of them would admit. George ran his thumb against Rita's knuckles. He finally realized what he was doing and slowly pulled his hand away. Rita didn't really want him to let go, but it wasn't up to her. There was still something about this situation that made her realize that her decisions were still not quite her own yet. "Okay, Mr. Ainsworth," Rita said, feigning an upbeat attitude. She wanted to hold onto his hand and look into his eyes for the whole night if she could. Something about George was softening, and she wanted to get to know all sides of him. "Now it's your turn to tell me what you're thinking." George didn't want to talk about what was on his mind. He much preferred talking about the present moment and what it could mean for the future. Instead, he sighed and opened his mouth to speak. "Julie," he said weakly, his eyes furrowed. "Julie," Rita said. She was admittedly taken aback. They had gone the whole night without mentioning her. "Yes, Julie.is here."
Chapter 6. Rita almost whipped her head around to take a look around, but George calmly shook his head. "She's spotted us and is heading our way," George said. Rita couldn't help but notice that his voice was unusually calm even though his jaw was clenched. He didn't seem to look very happy. Rita did as she was told and stayed put. She decided to keep her focus on the expression on George's face. Well, Rita could hear Julie's rigid voice behind her. She finally looked up to see George's ex-wife looming over them. She was in an elegant black dress that looked like it cost more than half a year of Rita's salary. She looked like an expensive beanpole, with a fierce gaze like that of a hawk, and her hair was gelled back in a bun like a member of the wait staff. She had new blonde highlights in her hair and her icy blue eyes seemed all the more icy in the dim light and against her dark dress and makeup. "What are you doing here, Julie?" George said. Rita was still so stunned with how calm and almost bored George's voice sounded. Julie, on the other hand, looked positively giddy. She now had a large smile on her face. "I just popped in to have a quick drink before attending a party." "Aren't you going to Artie Lohman's 50th? "I hear it's gonna be a gas," Julie said. Her eyes flickered from Rita to George, but she never removed that smile. To Rita, now Julie looked like a snake, like an eyelash viper. Her pupils almost looked more like slits than rounded. Rita tried not to think those thoughts. Julie had always had her back before. This war was clearly between Julie and George. I thought it would be too many people, George said. Judging and asking questions, no doubt, Julie said with a laugh. She touched the back of her head, like she was ensuring that her bun was still in place. She scoped the room before going back to focusing on the couple in front of her. She placed the hand she used to check her bun on the back of Rita's chair. No thanks to you, George said. His voice didn't waver in the slightest. He didn't even look angry. He picked up his wine glass and took a sip. He took a look at Rita for a moment and nodded slowly. It was his way of telling her to keep calm. People wanted answers, so I gave them some, Julie shrugged. Maybe instead of worrying about your old wife, you should make sure that you're faithful to your new one. Julie gave Rita a long hard look. Wealth certainly does suit you, Rita. Keep an eye on him, Julie said. She started to move away from the table and closer to the bar at the rear of the restaurant. She paused and then turned to face the couple again. I haven't forgotten my things. You haven't seen the last of me yet, Julie winked at them and then headed towards the bar again. She didn't turn to look at them or pay them any mind again. At least that's what Rita assumed. She was in Rita's vision, but Rita was too nervous to look at her. She either looked down or stole quick looks at George. You seem very calm, Rita said. You have to be if you've known Julie as long as I have. Nothing frustrates her more than when you don't blow your top like she normally would. I think the divorce either brought her some peace, or she realizes that screaming at me won't get her way, George said. He let out an angry grunt, but stifled it with more food and wine. Pretend she's not here. It's very hard to. She's almost directly behind you in my field of vision, Rita said. She was all around you for 3 years. But so was I. She just wants to cause trouble. Remember that I'm here for you. You're here for me because you're my boss. I'm not your boss anymore. I'm here for you because I'm your husband. Besides, I promised to take care of you, and that includes saving you from Julie's bullshit, George said. That made Rita very still. She was sure that she was even holding her breath. She was about to speak when she saw Julie heading toward them again. Got my drinks. Now, I'm off to party. I hope George isn't too much of a social pariah for long, Rita. You look like you could use a bit of fun, Julie waved at Rita, shot George a dirty look, and then left the restaurant. Or maybe it's you that I need. George started once Julie was long gone. You need me? Rita breathed. Yeah, I think I need you to save me from Julie. Maybe you've started already, George smiled. Rita couldn't help her thoughts. The way George was looking at her, and the way they had been able to talk about themselves so freely, and being able to just laugh with each other, Rita felt a new surge of hope within her. Maybe George was the man who would be there for her without her having to compromise who she was or what she stood for. They looked at each other for a while. George's smile turned curious, it almost looked hopeful like hers did. He looked down then, and Rita shook her thoughts away. There was no way that he could be thinking what she was thinking. She considered talking to George about how nice she found all of this. She wanted to tell him about what was in her heart, and to see if there could be any chance that this could be an arrangement that could turn into something real. But she didn't do that. Instead, she looked down too, and ordered herself some dessert. Rita couldn't wait for the following Thursday. She didn't want to call Jose to come earlier than he needed to. She wanted to see how the week would turn out after her evening with George. After dinner at the restaurant over the weekend, the two had managed to have breakfast and some dinners with each other at home. It was awkward to call the mansion her home now, and Rita was genuinely shy. But now, she could see it was getting easier to be open with George. He was very welcoming and kind to her. She always knew he had a kind nature about him, but he was particularly warm to Rita now that they were in the same house. Rita came out of the guest room more often, and would sometimes watch television with George or help him with a crossword puzzle. He, of course, would curse if he got a word wrong, or if someone on TV did something particularly stupid. Now Rita didn't feel like covering her mouth or stifling her laughter when he would swear or say a ridiculous phrase. It was freeing for her to laugh out loud. The best thing about it was that he was extremely humble about how much money he made. Or it could have been he was keeping track of all his finances because of the courts and potential alimony for Julie. Rita? Jose was at the side of the house and making his way to the back where Rita had been daydreaming about George. Rita, are you here? Out on the lanai. Rita called back. The lanai was a wonderful place to sit and think. The cleaning company had come early that day, and she decided to sit outside with a glass of lemonade. There you are. Good morning, princess. How are you? Jose said. He plopped on the armchair adjacent Rita and crossed his ankle over his knee. I think I'm doing well, Rita said. You think? Does this have anything to do with Julie the Scorpion woman? Jose asked. Not at all. Well, not most of it, Rita admitted and added. It's about myself. Rita hadn't even thought about the papers and what they could have been saying about her and George. He had been right, gossip came and went, and some days it was easier to handle than others. She was more concerned with what was in her heart than what was on a newspaper page. We had dinner the other night, and it was really nice. Before Julie made an appearance, Rita started. I would have thrown water in the bitch's face, Jose grumbled. Stop that. Rita warned. Jose rolled his eyes, but said nothing. He waited for Rita to continue. She doesn't have anything against me, I don't think. Her anger is geared toward George. Bitter, 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 Jose said while he shook his head. Rita shushed him and continued with her story. We were laughing and talking, and he said that he didn't regret any of this. He said he would marry me again if he could, Rita sighed. She didn't know how to tell Jose what was on her mind or in her heart, but she knew she trusted him most in the world. He had always been there for her, and there was no point in her holding anything back from him now. I think I'm in way over my head, Jose. I was thinking about what life could be like with George. Like if this marriage works out, then it could be for more than just the sake of papers. Jose still hadn't said anything. He could almost see the wheels turning in Rita's mind. She was trying to admit something to him that she was too afraid to even admit to herself. I think I might be falling for George, Rita said finally. It felt strange to her to finally be able to say those words out loud. That's heavy, Rita. What are you going to do about it? Jose asked. I don't know, she said with a sigh. Are you going to tell him? I can't do that. It could ruin everything, she exclaimed. Hey. First of all, relax. Mr. A has done a lot to keep you safe. He wouldn't have done that for just anybody. I think you should let him know how you feel. What's the worst that could happen? He could think I'm a gold-digging leech and get this marriage annulled, and then I'll be on the first flight back to Montreal, Rita said. She frowned. She knew she was being dramatic, but worse had happened to her in her life. She never had a chance to really love someone. When she thought she did, the man she lived with turned out to be an abuser. George Ainsworth was truly the most decent person she'd ever met, and now she couldn't help but fall for him. "Now you're just being silly, Marguerite." Jose clucked his tongue. "The man makes you happy. I can practically see you glowing from here. Even if nothing comes of it, you'll regret it more if you don't let him know how you feel. I bet he feels the same about you." Rita was about to open her mouth to counter something Jose was saying, but she heard the front door open. "Yoo-hoo! Anybody home?" Rita's eyes widened so much they could almost pop out of her skull. Julie Ainsworth was at the front entrance. How could she have come in? And Ainsworth had taken her key on the day of the wedding. "Hello? Oh, it's you two." Julie walked out onto the lanai like she still owned the place. She always looked like royalty, even if she was just running errands. "What are you doing here?" Jose asked. He had never hidden how he felt about Julie. She mostly laughed him off and waved him away. George was the only person on earth who seemed to faze her. "Spare key," she said, waving a gloved hand full of keys at them. "Now, I came to label the things I'm taking with me." "Does George know you're here?" Rita asked quietly. "I don't care what George knows, and you can tell him I said so," Julie said with a sneer. "There are things in here that belong to me that I'm taking. Gifts. Heirlooms. Treasures from times in my life I thought I was happy. You think I'm going to let George or anyone keep them from me?" "I don't think you should claim things without George being here," Rita said smoothly. She was trying her hand at George's technique. Stay calm and let Julie do all the silly talking. Rita wasn't going to get herself in a tizzy over this. She did still feel strange about being married now. Just a few weeks before, she didn't think she would be facing Julie this way, and certainly not as the lady of the mansion. Rita couldn't see, but Julie's eyes started to water a bit. She turned her head to look away, blinking several times as she did so. "I never said I'd take them, Rita," Julie said when she turned around. Her expression was back to being stone cold. "I'm putting labels and making a list. George can speak to me about them when he's ready. Still, I don't think that's a good idea. I'll let him know you stopped by, and you both can discuss this together," Rita said. She didn't want to be involved in any of this, but she figured it would be the only way to get peace. "So diplomatic," Julie said, raising a fierce eyebrow. She wanted to say more, but she thought better of it. "I can see why he loves you." Julie said nothing more and turned around to leave. Rita held her breath until she heard the front door close. Rita had been weighing the pros and cons in her mind over the last several days. It was early on Sunday morning, and an Ainsworth had invited the two of them to breakfast down by the pier. The thought of spending an entire day with George and his family made Rita's insides churn in the best and worst ways. George's father was away on business, so it would only be in there to entertain them, but she insisted. She knew that there would be press there, and it would be good for publicity to see that, and approved of Rita and had welcomed her into the family. It was Anne's idea, of course. Rita's thoughts had been racing since Thursday morning. Her mind kept running on Julie and Jose, even as she got ready, and went downstairs to the kitchen to get herself a cup of coffee. Since hearing Julie say that he loved her, Jose had tried to convince Rita to be bold about her feelings. This can't all be a coincidence. There's a reason this happened. The universe doesn't make mistakes, Jose had said. He nodded his head in the way he did when he felt proud of something wise he had said. Rita couldn't help but agree with Jose. He was right, and she knew it. If she didn't tell George, there would always be the thought in her mind, and she would never know if he felt the same way. But there was the other side of her that thought there was no possible way the feelings were mutual. Even with all that had been happening between them since the morning they were married, Rita was still so unsure. Her ex-boyfriend had made her doubt any feelings about herself or anyone in her life. But she hadn't seen him in years. George was nothing like her ex, and she wasn't that scared young woman anymore. It was time for her to be brave. It was time for her to tell the man in her life that she cared about him and wanted this to mean something more than a very important favor. The trouble was, she didn't know how to say it. She hadn't been bold enough to let her feelings known to anyone before. She was more turned off by the thought of being humiliated if her feelings for him weren't reciprocated more than anything else. Rita didn't know how she'd be able to face him after something like that. Rita heard the front door open, and she cringed. She was sipping on her coffee, and her mind wasn't in the mood to entertain any company until her breakfast with N. George was still upstairs, and that had given her some time to think. Rita half expected to see Julie sauntering in, but instead, in popped in Ainsworth. She looked very chipper for how early in the day it was. She had a bottle of wine in one hand and a squash racket in the other. "Well, good morning, sunshine. Or should I say bonjour?" and said with a delighted smile. "You're ready early." "You look nice," Rita said. She returned the smile, but it was a bit weak. She wasn't expecting company, and she was still in a bathrobe. "And bonjour. How is that son of mine doing? Is he ready yet? I wanted to bring you both some wine as a little gift. I figure you guys would enjoy it after we spend the morning together. You guys may need it after being in my company for long enough. What'd think? Think George would like it?" "I'm not sure," Rita said. George's mother put the bottle of wine down on a counter and turned to face Rita. She leaned on the counter and folded her arms over her chest. Rita had been alone with Anne before, but to see her now as her mother-in-law made her feel a bit strange. She didn't know what to talk to her about. She secretly hoped that George would walk through the door and that they would go to breakfast together. "Is everything all right?" Anne asked. Her expression turned serious as she eyed Rita. "I'm not sure," Rita said again. She was being honest. It wasn't that there was anything wrong, but the thought that something could be in the future made her anxious. "Are we playing squash?" "No, not at all. I played after Pilates and just before I came. I'm now positively famished, and I'd give anything for George to be down here. Can you imagine? We're the women and we're the ones who are ready before him," and said with a scoff. "Now, Rita. I know we don't exactly know each other, but we're family. Family can always tell when something is the matter. You know that you can talk to me about anything," and added. "Thank you, it's just that." "Good morning, ladies." George stepped into the kitchen. He looked extremely handsome this morning. The color of his shirt brought out the brightness in his eyes, and his hair had a beautiful wave to it. He kissed his mother on the cheek, and then ran his fingers along Rita's arm. Rita stood very still when he touched her. She could feel his warmth when his fingers brushed against her skin, and a small smile formed on her face. She looked down as he passed by behind her. When she looked up again, and was looking at her. "Ready to go?" George asked. "Yes, we are." "George, why don't you bring the car around?" Anne offered. George sighed and agreed. He stepped out of the kitchen and walked outside to start one of his cars. "Rita, will you stay with me a minute?" Anne asked. Rita was just about to follow George, but she stopped and turned to wait with Anne. "I think I know what's on your mind," Anne said. Her mouth curled up in a mischievous smile. Rita didn't say anything, but now her heart was racing. "It's about George, isn't it?" Rita didn't know how to answer that question. You don't have to be shy about it, it's written all over your face. You really love him, don't you? I don't know, Rita said. She couldn't bring herself to lie to Anne, but she had already been found out. I knew it! I wasn't sure, but when I saw the way you looked when he just touched you. Oh, this is wonderful! Anne said. She clapped her hands together. Why is it wonderful? Because you're such a lovely girl, Rita. You're bringing out something in George too, something I haven't seen in a long time, and said with a smile. What do you mean? Rita asked. She could barely hear herself over the sound of her beating heart. If Anne knew, then there was no doubt that it was obvious to George as well. Have you told him? Are you guys an item? I mean, other than the fact that you're technically already married, that is. Rita replied with a shake of her head. Well, I can tell there's something there. I can see it in the way that he looks at you, and the way he just touched your arm. I haven't seen him look at someone the way he looks at you in a long time. He seems happier. There is definitely something there, Rita. This looks like something magical. How can you tell? Because a mother knows, and tapped the side of her head with her finger and smiled again. A mother always knows.
Chapter 7. Breakfast with Anne Ainsworth was beautiful, and was funny and cursed like a sailor, and Rita now knew where George got it from. There were paparazzi, of course, but none of them paid them any mind. Rita still wasn't used to the celebrity lifestyle, but Anne told her to constantly have some form of smile on her face and otherwise just ignore them and she'd be fine. Rita laughed, but Anne's advice really worked. My mother really likes you, George said when they had gotten back to the mansion. They had gone up the stairs, and George paused to lean on the banister. He looked thoughtful. I like her too. She's so funny, Rita laughed. There's something about you, it seems, George said. He flashed her a smile that nearly melted her soul. He was just so handsome. She hadn't ever stopped to stare at him before. She was always so busy with her work. Now that they were spending more time together, Rita paused to take a look at George whenever she got the chance to. There's something about you, Rita said boldly. What about me? George asked. His expression was curious. He searched Rita's face with his eyes and waited. You spoke about me first. What is it about me? Rita asked. Blood rushed to her ears, and she felt her face getting warmer. There is a light about you. I'm not sure what it is, but when I see you. George stopped himself. He swallowed and closed his eyes for a long time. Rita, he started to speak again. Rita moved closer to him, her eyes wide with curiosity. She couldn't believe that any of this was happening. Was he going to tell her what she was hoping to hear? George breathed out and seemed to change his mind. He shook his head and looked away. George, Rita started. His eyes went back to her. If you want to tell me that you have feelings for me, then I think now's the time to tell me. Rita couldn't believe that she had just said those words. There was never a time in her life that she recalled being so bold. George started laughing. Rita wasn't expecting that kind of response, but George's deep voice echoed throughout the house. She also didn't ever remember a time when she heard him laugh. Was he laughing at her? George held out his arms and pulled Rita in close to him. Rita, I'm not sure how this happened, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about you. I think I'm falling for you, George said. His face was now a bright red. Rita didn't know if it was him blushing or the fact that he had just been giddy with laughter that did it. Rita didn't care. All she could think about was that she was in George's arms. She was in her husband's arms, and he was falling for her like she had been falling for him. George, I'm falling for you too. The moment the words left her was when George leaned in and planted a kiss on her lips. He kissed her deeply. Her body went from rigid with nerves to being completely relaxed. She allowed herself to melt into his arms as he explored the flavors of her lips with his own. She didn't want to come up for air. She didn't want to pull away. Every part of George surrounded her. She felt safe. She was engulfed by his touch and his love for her.
Hi there, unfortunately we've had to take this steamy scene out as it's against YouTube's terms of service.
If you don't want to miss out on love scenes for this and other stories, check the description and join our inner circle via Romancely Audio Velvet. Warning, things between the couples get super hot, and it's not for the faint-hearted.
If you're already a member, the love scene references The Billionaire's Housekeeper, Chapter 7, Love Scene 2. Okay, back to the story.
How was it? Rita had just finished telling Jose about the morning before last. He had invited her to his apartment in the city for brunch. He had cooked, and they were both now giggling and gossiping as if they were still in high school. She was wearing a long summer dress that George had got for her and a floppy hat and sunglasses. She was partially in disguise. She didn't want any paparazzi to stop and ask her any questions. She was less worried than she had been before. If they asked her anything, all she needed to do was say that she was happy, and then go off on her merry way. And Rita had been very happy as of late. She and George had made love at least 3 times over the last few days. Talking about it made her clit jump. She reminisced and closed her eyes. It was perfect. George is perfect, she said dreamily. See? Aren't you glad you decided to tell him how you feel? Jose said. He playfully nudged her, and Rita tried to hide a smile. She was still thinking about the way George made her feel, whether being inside her or not. Yeah, I'm very glad. Good, because I haven't seen you this happy since. He paused to remember. Hell, I don't think I've ever seen you this happy. And who would have thought? Rita knew she definitely wouldn't have imagined this moment. 2 months ago, she was still just the helper. She still had her secret, and she didn't know what she was going to do about it. George Ainsworth had saved Rita in more ways than one. He had saved her from the press, the authorities, and he saved her from hiding from her truest self. He saved her by making her feel worthy again. It didn't even have anything to do with his money. He wasn't the bragging sort. Money was no object to him, though it could have been since he had been a billionaire and had come from money even before he began his business. They went to nice places, and sometimes Rita would wake up to a beautiful designer dress, or jewelry, or interesting pastries made by French chefs. But George was so down to earth that he never flaunted the money he did have. The thing is, our marriage isn't going to be considered legal for almost 2 months. Rita sighed. She knew that she could wait, but there were a number of things that could happen in that time. Julie could find a way to undermine George. She could claim that since there had been an affair, George broke the terms of their prenup and would therefore need to spend more time in court working out finances. Rita didn't want George to have to go through any of that. It wouldn't be fair. That's nothing. Just enjoy each other until then, and celebrate when everything is legal. You can hold out until then, Jose said. I hope so, Jose. I really hope so. Rita was surprised to find George at the mansion. She saw his briefcase on the 2nd floor beside an open door. He didn't look as happy as he had been recently. He was sitting on the 2nd floor balcony near Julie's former studio. George hadn't been in that space since the morning before everything had changed. His eyebrows were furrowed, as if he was having a silent argument in his mind, and he stared out into the garden. What are you doing home so early? Rita asked. She tried to sound cheerful. She was still feeling giddy from spending the afternoon with Jose and letting him in on the happiness that was going on in her life. He had dropped her off after their brunch, and she didn't want to assume the worst just because of the expression on George's face. She waited for him to speak. He stared out into the garden for a long time, and he had yet to acknowledge her. Rita wondered if he had even heard her at all. Her mind was racing with all sorts of things. Was he fired? No, that was silly. He couldn't have been fired from his own company, not unless the entire board had voted him out. If that were the case, then it was probably due to all the negative press they were getting because of the home-wrecking housekeeper who had dissolved one of America's youngest, most successful couples. It didn't help that she was a black woman from a lower-class family, and that he was from an upper-class upbringing and was golden-haired and bright-eyed. Rita shook her head to shake the thoughts away. He hadn't said anything yet, and she was already jumping to the worst possible conclusions. She was so used to things falling apart since having to leave Montreal, that complete happiness, and feeling so much love was new to her. "We need to talk." "Rita?" George said, breaking Rita away from her thoughts. His voice was stiff and cold. Rita's insides plummeted, and she felt all the blood from her face draining too. "Did something happen?" She stood a few feet away from George. He still hadn't looked at her. He was staring blankly out at the garden. Rita could see her little cottage from there, but she turned to keep her focus on George. He looked like he had so much to say, but he couldn't find the right words to use in order to say them. George didn't know how to tell her exactly what was on his mind. Julie called him earlier that day. There were things she wanted from him, and she promised that she wouldn't leave him alone until she got her way. She was out for more of her possessions. She had let him know that because she was wronged, she needed to be adequately satiated financially for all of the emotional damage. George had let Julie go on her tirade, as he usually did. It made him bored and tired. They weren't like this in college or when they were first married. Was it the wealth that changed her so much? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he was worried that love wouldn't last, that anything could change at any given moment, and there would be constant fighting and bickering. He couldn't put himself through that again, and he didn't know how to tell Rita. "I don't think that this is working," he said instead. It was easier this way. The less Rita knew, the better it would be. If he could get everything in his life to slow down now, he could sort out his heart and his thoughts. "What do you mean?" "I mean what it is that we have," George sighed. "Trying to make this work is proving difficult. I have my business and reputation to think about. I have to get Julie off my back. And being with someone so soon after the divorce might not be the best idea." "Are you scared?" Rita asked. George wasn't expecting for that to be her reaction, but he nodded his head slowly. He really was scared. He was afraid of starting over. "I'm afraid too. I didn't think this would happen," she said and added. "But I don't regret any of this. I feel like we can work it out if we give it time. We can keep getting to know each other. If you're worried about work or Julie, then we can go through these things together. You won't have to face them alone now because you have me. I'm here for you." Rita was speaking very fast. Her speaking matched the violent rhythm of her heartbeat. She had been so happy not too long ago. How could it be that everything was crashing down around her now? "I'm sorry, Julie. I can't do this," he said weakly, still not able to look at her. "Julie? My name is Rita," she sputtered. Her voice cracked. He was comparing her to the woman in his past, the woman who had made his heart cold. That was when George finally looked up at her. He looked like he was in pain. "I'm sorry," he said again. He stood up and took a step toward her while she took a step back. "Please enjoy the mansion. I'll be spending a few days with Mother. I have to sort my thoughts out. When I come back, we can discuss how we proceed from there. Please try to understand." Rita didn't know how to respond to any of this. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't expecting for things to turn out like this. George moved forward and tried to give Rita a kiss on her cheek, but she moved her head away. To her, he might as well have said that he didn't love her, and that he would rather spend his time alone. George pulled away and lowered his head. He was ashamed, but he didn't know how else to handle any of this. He didn't want anyone to be hurt. Rita was numb now. She could barely process what it was that was happening. She watched him walk away from her. She watched his frame disappear from view. She didn't know what she could do or say. There wasn't anything that she could say at this point. He was already gone. All Rita could do was stand on the balcony and look out into the garden.
Chapter 8. "I know, Mother, but this is all so new. And so sudden." George and were out by the pier at their favorite seafood restaurant. The sky was almost blackened by the chance of a coming rainstorm, but they decided to chance it anyway. George had spent the last few days with Anne, who didn't feel as if she was overstepping a boundary when she continued to mention to him that he was making a huge mistake. George explained to Anne what Julie had said, and how difficult it was for him to balance so many things in his life. Trying to help Rita had changed the course of everything. The public thought he was sleazy, the value of his company plummeted because of bad press, and Julie was asking to be compensated even more for emotional damages that didn't even exist. "Don't listen to that viper. She just wants to make trouble for everyone." She always has, and Ainsworth said. She put a straw in her mouth and sucked down a Bloody Mary. That's not what I mean. I meant what's been happening with Rita. Oh. You two finally admitted you're head over heels for each other, and now you're running away like a child? And snorted into her straw. She was on her third drink, and George knew he would have to cut her off soon. She was a tumultuous drunk, but the worst part was that she had no filter, and was usually always right. Yes. But with all that's happening with Julie. I don't think this is something I can handle right now, George sighed and looked down at his barely eaten meal. What are you saying? Anne said. She was looking very serious now. She really liked Rita, and she liked how she was making George happier. The thing standing in the way was her ex-daughter-in-law who was out to destroy everything for George out of plain spite. I may have to end things with Rita. It may be for the best. That's total bullshit, George, and hiccuped. Don't let the pain of one relationship carry into another. Rita isn't anything like Julie, thank God, and you could use a bit more happiness in your life. Look what Julie's doing to you. You can't turn away from someone who really loves you. Who you really love. How many of us get a chance to find love under such amazing circumstances? George rolled his eyes. He was about to respond when he heard his phone ringing. He took it out of his pocket and answered it. Mr. A? Jose? George was surprised to hear Jose on the other end of the line. Mr. A, where are you? Jose sounded almost frantic. That made George perk up in his chair, his eyes wide. And leaned in closer in an attempt to eavesdrop, but she couldn't hear the voice on the other end of the call. What's going on, Jose? George asked. It's Rita. I tried to stop her, but she says she won't change her mind, Jose said desperately. I was with her the night that you left. She's been crying for days now. She told me this morning that she booked a flight back to Montreal. What? George shouted. Several people walking by turned their heads to see what all the commotion was about, but quickly went back to their own business. I've been trying to talk her out of it. I told her to wait for you. She said she couldn't wait and that she was doing the best that she could for herself. She took out what was left in her savings, Jose said. He was exasperated. The one person he knew Rita would listen to was George. He didn't want to see his friend get hurt, but he knew that she loved George, and that was all that mattered to Jose. He didn't want her to leave with so much left unsaid, and to put herself in potential danger by going back to Montreal. When is her flight? George asked desperately. At 5 today. And suddenly nothing else mattered to George. His business would survive, the press would move on, and Julie would eventually be bored. The only thing that mattered to him right now was Rita. He was prepared to let her go in order to save himself, and now she was going to leave him. He couldn't have that. Thank you, Jose. Thank you. I won't let her leave. Please tell her not to go, George said. He hung up the phone and looked up at his mother, who was staring wide-eyed at him. What in the hell is happening? She asked. I can't talk right now. I have to go, George said, grabbing his belongings and getting up from the chair. And shook her head at him as he turned away. Finally, she muttered loudly enough for him to hear before taking another long sip of her Bloody Mary. It was pouring rain by the time George got to the mansion. He didn't care that he was soaking wet when he burst through the door. He was moved by adrenaline, fear, and anger. He was afraid that he couldn't fix things with the woman he truly cared about, and he was overwhelmed by how furious he was with the woman from his past. He called Julie on his way back to the mansion, and gave her a piece of his mind. He wasn't going to be threatened or talked down to. He was so upset that he ended up telling Julie the whole truth of the matter, and that there hadn't ever been an affair. Julie blubbered through the phone and had more to say, but he didn't bother listening. He hung up the call before she could speak. If there was anything else that she needed to say, then she could get in touch with his lawyer. "Rita?" George called out once he shut the door behind him. He was dripping from head to foot. He was so full of adrenaline that the cold hadn't even hit him yet. George trudged through the house, leaving a trail of water everywhere. He called out to Rita as he made his way through the rooms and even up the stairs. Her things weren't in the guest room, even though she had moved a lot of them to the main bedroom since they had professed their feelings to one another. George went to search his room, but her things weren't in there either. His heart sank. It was too late. She was gone, and he didn't know how on earth he could find her now. He moved toward the second-floor balcony. That was the best place for him to clear his head. He stopped in Julie's art studio for a minute. He looked around at the vast emptiness of it. It was no longer Julie's place for escape, it was now his own. It gave him his favorite view of the gardens. He would be able to see the little white cottage from there. George's eyes filled with tears, and as they trickled down his face, they merged with the raindrops that were flowing down his body. He was feeling everything that mattered to him slip away. He left Julie's studio and took a step onto the balcony. The sky was as dark as ever, and there was no sign of any possibility that the rain would stop anytime soon. He found his favorite chair and sat in it. He let his tears flow freely as he looked out into the garden. That was when he noticed something. He was too sad to look out at the cottage at first, but as his eyes scoped the grounds he noticed something. He wasn't sure, but it looked like there was a light coming from one of the rooms in the cottage. "Rita!" George shot out of his chair, nearly tripping over himself, and ran out of the studio and down the stairs. He moved towards the side of the house and to the lanai. He paused only for a moment to look up at the sky, but nothing was going to keep him away, not Julie, not the paparazzi, and certainly not something as silly as the rain. George stepped off the lanai and out into the garden. He kicked off his shoes and took off his socks and then broke out into a run. If there was a chance, he was going to take it. He ran across the gardens, closer and closer to the little cottage. Now that he was closer, he could see that the door was left ajar. That meant that she must have still been there. "Rita," he called out into the rain, but there was no way that she could hear him through all of it. He got to the porch and reached out to open the front door. His lungs ached and his legs burned from the running, but he didn't care. He needed to see her. He needed to make things right. George opened the door and staggered inside of the cottage. His mind was racing with all of the things he wanted to say to her when he saw her. But there she was. Rita was standing in the living room. She was holding a pile of folded clothes, and all she could do was stare at George. His mind drew a blank. All he could do was think about how beautiful she looked. He wanted to hold her, but he knew that she wouldn't want that. He closed the door behind him, and they stared at each other for a while. Neither of them knew what the other was thinking. Neither of them wanted to speak first. There was so much to say between them that it almost felt like the walls were closing in on them. The only sound was the rain pouring outside, but the cabin was so quiet inside that Rita could hear George's heavy breathing clearly. "What are you doing here?" Rita's voice was weak but defiant. She didn't take her eyes off of him. George pushed a clump of wet hair back and breathed deeply a few times before getting ready to speak. "Please, don't go," George said. His voice was pleading, but Rita couldn't tell if it was because he was cold and tired from running in the rain, or if it could have been something else. "I think I have to," Rita said. She finally looked down at the pile of clothes in her hands as if seeing them for the first time. She didn't have much more to pack, and the driver was waiting to take her to the airport in a few hours. I spoke to my mother already. She's expecting me. I'll bring her, George said brightly, as if now there were a glimmer of hope. Whatever I have to do, whatever it takes, Rita, I'll do it. You don't have to do that. Using your money is the last thing I want to do. I just wanted to grow with you, George, a lump formed in Rita's throat. It's not like that. I just thought it would be better to grow as much as I can for myself before trying anything with someone new. She looked skeptically at him. Just a few weeks ago he hadn't been sure about her. He didn't know if this was something that he could venture into because of his past. Julie was still very much in the picture, and she probably wouldn't go away until she had drained George of all the money that he owed her. What about Julie? What about Julie? He echoed with an exasperated sigh. If you want to know, I talked to her. I told her the truth about everything. I told her there was never an affair, and I was doing what I could to help you. Oh, Rita said. I also told her that I was falling madly in love with you. Our marriage isn't a sham, Rita. I want to do anything I can to make it work with you. George was talking so fast now that Rita could barely keep up. It was unlike him to be so nervous, but it had been a long time since he'd really bared his soul to anyone. But we come from two different worlds, George. I'll never be a socialite or a debutante. And who says you have to be? I didn't fall for a debutante, I fell for you. We came from two different worlds, but something brought us together and we've made our own world from it. It's a world I've never known before, and I'd like to spend as much of my life exploring that new world with you. Rita didn't realize she was crying until a sob escaped her lips. She put the pile of laundry down on the armchair nearest her and began to wipe her eyes. George took long strides towards her, taking out a handkerchief from his breast pocket and handing it to her. Rita laughed. It was soaking wet. It's good to hear you laugh, George said. He gently lifted her face so that she could meet his gaze. You really want to make this work? Rita asked. Her expression had turned serious once again, and her eyes danced, trying to catch even the slightest change in his expression. George nodded and offered her a warm smile. He shivered just then. Rita moved her hands onto his wet shirt and helped him remove his wet jacket. Let's get you out of those wet clothes, she said. She took him by the hand and led him to the bedroom inside of the little cottage. Once they reached the bedroom, George spun Rita around to face him and drew her closer. She didn't care that her blouse was getting soaked. He still felt warm pressed up against her. George lowered his face and kissed Rita softly on her cheek. The blood rushed to her face, and she felt like she was on fire being so close to him. She held his face with her hands and rubbed her thumb against his rugged cheek. Rita tiptoed and kissed George. It didn't scare her anymore. This felt right. This is where she wanted to be, and this is who she wanted to be with.
Oh no, another love scene had to be taken out due to YouTube's policies.
If you haven't already, sign up to the premium Romancely Audio Velvet membership to get love scenes for all stories. 18 plus only, this naughtiness is strictly for adults.
Link to join this exclusive club is in the description.
If you're already an exclusive member, the love scene references, The Billionaire's Housekeeper, Chapter 8, Love Scene 3.
Signed up? Good, now back to the story.
Will you stay with me, Rita? George whispered into her ear, planting soft kisses about her face. On one condition, Rita giggled. George pulled away and looked into her eyes. Anything I can do, I'll do it. Rita kissed him again. She felt more at home in his arms than anywhere else on earth. As long as we get to explore the world we created together more often, she said. She raised an eyebrow and flashed him a seductive smile. Anything I can do for you, I'll do it, he said again. The two of them curled up in each other's arms, neither one wanting to let go. The end.
If you want more billionaire romances like this, please, my love, be sure to subscribe to the Romancely YouTube channel. I look forward to spending more time with you. Subscribe and let's make it happen.